Belinda and Penguin Random House Australia present this unabridged recording of The Last Convict, written by Anthony Hill and read by Julian Garner. For Richard Morris, in friendship, and to the memory of my great uncle, Edward Waring, who left me his books. Do not go gentle into that good night. Dylan Thomas. Forward. The Last Convict is a work of historical fiction based on the life of Samuel Speed, who believed himself to be, and is widely accepted as, the last of the transported convicts to survive in Australia. He lived into the modern era, dying in November 1938 on the eve of the Second World War. Very little is known about him. Even his true identity is uncertain from the many Samuel Speeds born in England during the 1840s. I have reconstructed his story on the basis of the fairly meagre established facts on the public record and an interview he did with a Perth newspaper only a few months before his death. The whole book, indeed, is built around that August morning when he gave this interview to the Mirror reporter. While it remains an historical novel, for interested readers, I have included in the appendices the full interview as published, complete with errors as noted, the report of Speed's trial at Oxford in 1863, and a timeline of the known details of his life. Anthony Hill, Canberra, 2020. 1. Old Men. Perth, Western Australia, August 1938.
It wasn't me.
The old lag stirred uneasily on his dormitory bed. At liberty in sleep, yet imprisoned still within a frail body and held by the shackles of memory. He'd been dreaming, as he often did, of smoke and fire, the gum-scented pleasures of a billy boiling in a bush camp, and a yarn over the coals after a day's labour. Sweet dreams. Shifting, in the way they do, to an image of hot cast iron and an ember glow that sweated but never warmed you, as too many broken old men huddled around the stove on a winter's night. The aroma of salt beef boiling in the mess deck copper on the transport Belgravia, drifting with the sea breeze to the convict decks below. Food that filled yet failed to nourish. And before that, a smell of dry grass and sulphur, for the ghosts had become more disturbing. A wicked yellow flame, and a pale spectre of smoke that rose in the darkness to billow and surround him, acrid and flecked with black burning cinders, until he could see nothing else and cried out in his fear, "It wasn't me!" Samuel Speed woke up, frightened, as always, by the old vision. The blanket was in a tangle and the sheets damp, as if he'd wet himself in the night. Not uncommon now at his age, though he hoped it was only perspiration and not the result of a too vivid nightmare. Incontinence was frowned upon.
I'm sorry,
He'd have to tell Matron.
but what do you expect in my 90s?
Samuel felt his breath laced with the panic of wrongdoing, for he was still caught in the shrouds of the past. He lay in the narrow bed, eyes closed a little longer to let himself return more gently to the present and the waking day. Lying on one side, he carefully brought his knees together in a fetal position, and with elbows and feet slowly levered himself onto his back. It was one way to avoid the agonies of leg cramp from any sudden movement, and ease the strain on both groins from his double hernia and the pressure of what remained in his bladder. He could sometimes manage it without assistance or pain, and succeeding this morning, Speed allowed the sense of accomplishment gradually to displace those lingering feelings of dread ignited by the phantom bonfire.
No phantom, though.
He opened his eyes, and, for a moment, Sam Speed imagined himself still enveloped by the smoke cloud. The morning light coming from the window was white and opaque, through which only shadows moved, like fog on the Swan River outside, or the Thames at Chatham. Until he realized he was also incarcerated in his blindness, or very nearly so. The bad eye had been scarred as a boy, and from then on was permanently misted, like pale opal. The authorities put it down to a cataract, not knowing that cataracts are usually another affliction of age. The other eye had been all right until his middle years, when it also began to fail. But, praise God, I can still see a little, Sam thought, in silent morning prayer. Enough to read the newspaper, anyway, with the help of a large magnifying glass, once the eye settled, hunched over a table in the day room, the page 6 inches from his face, like some decrepit Sherlock Holmes. He laughed. Not that it was worth the bother, filled with talk of depression and now war, though he could still get a chuckle from the comic cartoon. Books were out, however. Had been for a long time. It was too hard to maintain the sense of them, squinting at the tiny words through that thing. So, thank heaven for Braille, as Sam returned to the Almighty and the man who invented it for allowing him still to have stories at his fingertips. And also, as an afterthought, for the person who thought of putting the new talking books on gramophone records. Samuel was never one to let himself dwell too much on the hardships of life. Such things were better left to his dreams. To the outside world, even to his maker, Speed tried to adopt the cheerful countenance of his literary namesake, Mr. Samuel Smiles, and thus he lay there thinking and letting his good eye adjust to the patterns of the day. Good was a relative term, of course, for Sam's sight was such that anything much beyond the end of his arm was a blur. The best he could manage this morning was to concentrate on the contours of his right hand, stretched limply across his chest. A thin, brittle hand, wrinkled like tissue paper, through which the bones stuck out as ridges and the Blue River veins ran as if through a painted landscape, mottled brown with freckles like the summer country around the Vassar. An old man's hand that had seen much, done much, these 90 years or so. The strength that once allowed him to lift a chaff bag or dig a garden bed had departed long ago, however, as had the interest in his own anatomy. Besides, as vision failed, his other senses had become more acute. And as the emotions roused by smoke and fire receded into the darkness, they were replaced in Samuel Speed's consciousness by the early morning dormitory sounds of those about him. The old fellow in the next bed grunting as he strove to stay asleep, coughs and mutters, somebody urinating into the metal chamber pot. A magpie started to sing outside the window. Break-a-day birds, they used to call them, and one chap, in need of conversation during those lonely weeks out as a shepherd, even taught one to speak. He was happy, so they said. Unlike those two at the other end of the ward, quarrelling as one tried to cadge a smoke. Get away with you, it's me last. Bastard. Bludger. Ever the same. Somebody farting. Jesus, from the next bed, taking the Lord's name, open the flaming window. The odour of his own body. A kind of stale, fetid sickliness that never scrubbed out. An old man's stink, but more than that, Samuel. It's the whiff of too many bodies crammed together in one place for far too long, experience told him. And that is something you have known all your life. Indeed, he'd become used to it, had to, in the workhouse, in prisons from Oxford to Fremantle, the Belgravia, convict depot, boarding houses he had known, Braille Society rest home at Victoria Park, Perth Hospital, and now back in the crowded ward of the old men's home at Dalkeith. Silly Sam Speed had been in an institution of one kind or another for the better part of his 90-odd years. and the smell of it never went away, not even using laundry soap in the bath last night, and they'd given him clean clothes again. What was that for? There was something about today. Samuel's mind tried to search the possibilities. This forgetting was the worst of growing old, something he had to do. The trouble was not just the disintegrating body. The cobwebs of age were spinning a cocoon over the brain as well, so that the past generally seemed more alive to him than the present. Church? No, that was only a few days ago. A service in the dining hall. And he'd had a bath on Saturday night. Only one a week allowed, so why two? Were they going to tell Sammy he'd won the lottery? There was a piece in the paper not long ago about an old-timer who'd scooped up a fortune. But no, he didn't gamble. Yet the paper... That was it. Some fellow from the newspaper was coming to see him today. Wanted to do an interview with him. So, of course, he had to be clean-smelling and all smartened up. Mr. Rust had told him about it only yesterday, when he was called into the superintendent's office. "It's a reporter from the Weekend Mirror, Sam. He wants to talk to you." "What about?" "Oh, about yourself and the old days and what it was like. Take a photograph, too, and publish it in the newspaper." "Oh, I'll break the camera?" Sammy was always ready with a laugh. "And why me, Mr. Rust?" "Well, because of who you are. He's heard that you're the last of the old ex-convicts still among us. The last of the expirees, so far as we're aware, anyway." Expirees. That was a word rarely heard nowadays. An ugly word, as if he had already expired and gone to his grave. Certainly, it was something Samuel Speed rarely talked about to anybody else, except when he had to. Tried to keep hidden, in fact. The others had gone, and even after all these years the shame was still palpable, in the looks and small, distasteful shifts of the body if anything was said to the respectable. Swan River lags, they used to be called in contempt, back east. They even tried to stop them from entering the uncontaminated air of South Australia after they'd served their time. And Samuel Speed, convict indent number 8996, wasn't at all sure he'd want his past exposed on the front page of a newspaper. The secrecy of his iron bed was enough to bear. "It's a good story, Samuel." Albert Rust could see the doubt on his inmate's countenance. "You're a piece of living history. Here we are in 1938, 70 years after transportation to Western Australia ceased, and you're still alive, hale and hearty." "I don't know about the hale, boss." It was the name they all called him. "I'm falling apart, held together with me truss straps." "Hearty, anyway. Never without a cheery word, Sam. And you don't have to tell them everything, nothing too grim. Just the amusing things, little anecdotes that people like to read. You'll be famous. And besides," as the superintendent turned from flattery to self-interest, "it would be a big help to the home." "How?" "Well, it's always a struggle to raise donations from people to buy those extra comforts we like to give our inmates." Rust was a large, expansive man and spread his hands wide. "Books and another wireless and little treats, especially in these times. A nice article about you, Sam, will bring us to the attention of readers and perhaps even encourage them to be generous, as we have been very generous to you over the years, as you well know." He smiled broadly, as officials ever do when tightening the moral screws. "So I told him to come tomorrow, in the morning when you're not too tired, if that's all right." It would have to be. "I suppose so, Mr. Rust, if you wish it." With a little bow and knuckle to the forehead, as always, to those in authority. And to be fair, the boss was a decent-hearted man, far better than many workmasters and superintendents Sam Speed had known in his life. If he thought it a good thing, and Sammy could help. Still, he sought to put the interview out of his mind for the rest of the day, and even tried not to think about it last night, which perhaps was why his dreams had been so intense. But lying here this morning before the 7:15 getting up bell, the sounds of other men about him, Sam couldn't help but rehearse the sorts of things he might say. Nothing unpleasant, Bert Rust had advised, and if nothing else, during his 9 decades on this earth, Speed had become adept at burying his secrets deep and telling people only those things he wanted them to hear. Not lying, exactly, for that would be sinful, but a small exaggeration here, a gloss about his age there, tossed off with a joke. And some things he could truthfully tell the reporter from the mirror.
I've never been in a chain gang, he murmured to himself. My back bears the scars of no whip.
No, by God, for the penal system had put the fear of Christ into Samuel Speed, quite literally, though that was something he would also keep to himself.
I learnt me lesson,
was the most he would say,
and came out of it a well-travelled man. It brought me halfway round the world, eh?
Sam was still chuckling at his prepared jest when the bell began to ring. 15 minutes to breakfast and the orderlies would be on their rounds. His whole life had been governed by bells, the man's free will replaced long ago by their insistence. When to eat, work, sleep and rise determined by official regulation. There was a certain comfort in that, knowing these essential routines of life were taken care of by somebody else, and you didn't have to worry about them like you did outside. Nevertheless, the old man still occasionally felt the need to rebel, and so he lay there, refusing to get up and face the day, even though all around him 30 men were creaking out of bed, piddling in the pot, grumbling, dressing, lighting the first fag of the day, and squabbling over the wash basin. You didn't want to be late for a meal. Tammy. He heard the voice of an orderly, felt him touching his shoulder and a little shake. Wakey, wakey, Sammy. Time to rise and shine, mate. It's your big day.
Yes.
A long pause as the old chap dragged his thoughts back from the past imperfect to present indicative.
How's it, Bob?
Bit cloudy. Still cool and a chance of rain, I reckon. Easy there, Sammy, as the old man felt Bob's arms slide between his shoulder blades and the kapok pillow and began to lift him. Hold on to me other arm, here. With bony elbows, knuckles and feet acting as secondary props, Speed hoisted himself up. That was always the hardest part of the day, and he sat there catching his breath and looking at Bob's shadowy presence.
Thanks, Cobber. Could you pass over me falsies?
Bob picked the dentures from the bedside glass and put them in Sam's hand. A nice enough fella, he couldn't be much more than half Sam's age. One of the tuppenny orderlies, an inmate like himself, but still with his strength and reliable, who did all sorts of jobs around the home. In the hospital block, kitchen, yards, helping old codgers in the wards who were past it. There were quite a few of them here, in return for which they got paid 2 pence a day. 2pence, see? And a plug of tobacco. Well, they all got that. Clay pipe, too, in the old days. Oh, Sammy, have you pissed yourself in the night? The orderly uncovered the old bloke's limbs and prepared to set him upright.
Sweat, I reckon, Bob. I felt hot.
Samuel fumbled putting the teeth into his mouth. They were a nice set, too. A pal got him second-hand from a jumble sale. Course it was. Excitement, more like. All right, I'll take the sheets to the laundry for you. They won't know. He helped Sam swing his legs over the edge of the bed, and holding him under the arms, rather like mother lifting a child out of the bath, gradually coaxed and manoeuvred him into the vertical position. He stood there giddily a moment, skinny shanks, poking beneath the old cotton nightshirt he always wore, trembling with the exertion of it all. Shrunken chest heaving as mind and body laboured to restore equilibrium.
Have you got me stick handy, Bob?
Right here. Grabbing it and balancing on his 3 legs like an unsteady tripod. Samuel Speed, the very picture, in his dotage, of Shakespeare's 7th age of man. Remembered from those days when that clever old sot, Clary Short, would recite to him sans teeth, sans eyes, sans everything. Or almost everything.
Have you got the chamber pot there, Bob?
For he still had to pee. Coming right up. An awfully tedious business, however, as it dribbled out in teaspoonfuls. Another measurement of age. Sometimes he'd have to ask for the receptacle 3 or 4 times in the course of putting on his clothes. His midriff bursting to go, and then nothing happened. Though this morning, Sam was glad to sense, the stream seemed reasonably plentiful. Perhaps he'd need it only twice. He sat back on the bed as Bob helped him dress. Relieving himself had eased some of the pressures on Samuel's abdomen, but the mere fact of standing created others, especially for his old trouble, the hernia.
The belt, Bobby, quick!
The nightshirt had rolled up about his waist, and he looked down at his willy, a poor, flabby bit of gristle these days, just visible through the mist. Useless for anything except passing water, and had been for years. Difficult to remember when he'd last known a woman, other than matron and the nurses, but you never looked at them like that. And Sam had never known a wife. Always down by the river or a back alley somewhere he was ashamed to remember God. His shriveled balls and tuft of body hair were hemmed in now by swellings, as part of his intestine bulged through the abdominal wall into each groin. Hence the truss to push them back, for the hernias could be very painful, especially if they descended into his scrotum. They had put Sammy away several times. Indeed, he'd come back to the home from the Braille House at Victoria Park only last month, after another spell in hospital, and he was far too old to operate. But really, it was like getting into harness, as Bob guided his feet through the leg straps and raised the contrivance up to his waist. Clinging on to the man again to stand as the orderly tightened the belt, the pads on either side of his privates helping to push the intestine back inside. What a thing! What a way to end up! His scrawny frame kept intact, as he told the boss only yesterday, by the girth of a hernia truss.
You deserve every one of those tuppences, Bob,
as he eased himself back onto the bed. Worth 4 pence a day having to put up with you, you old bugger, they sniggered. Hands up, still, as Bob pulled the nightshirt over his head. Sam glanced down at what he could see of his aged torso, more bone than flesh now, the few wisps of hair on his sunken chest, sallow belly sagging in his nakedness. He'd never been a tall fellow, not much more than 5'3" in his prime, but sturdy and toughened by hard labour. Now, in this 7th age, he'd be lucky to make 5 foot. Like his mother, he seemed to recall, and his head a hollow skull with a layer of sunburnt skin stretched over it. Hands up, still, as Bob pulled the flannel undershirt over his head and eased arms into the sleeves. Sammy always wore his flannel, regular as a prison uniform.
Well, I'm used to it and feel the cold. And don't forget me long johns. I've got no reserves of fat left on me, Bob,
as the underwear was pulled up and buttoned. His brown trousers and loose jacket, courtesy of the government, freshly washed and pressed from the laundry to make him nice for the interview. Linen overshirt, courtesy of the charity shop.
The shirts used to be stamped WAG, Bob. Did you know that? Western Australian Government. And us old lags called ourselves the old wags. Pretty funny, eh?
Hilarious, Sammy. Now keep still while I put on your shoes and socks.
I wish it were boots. I always liked boots.
They said shoes for the gentleman.
I can still tie me own laces if I get the foot close enough up to me eye.
It will take you all day, mate. That reporter will have come and gone. Talking of which, The breakfast bell's already gone. We'd better move it if you're to get some tucker.
They're greedy about their food, them blokes. Always have been.
You want me to scrounge something from the infirmary, or shall we try the hall?
Oh, the dining hall, Bob. They're all sick and ailing at that other place.
Unlike himself. Then best foot forward. Bob took hold of Samuel's arm.
I could find my own way,
as the old man tried to shake him off, independent as always. It will take forever, chum, limping along with your stick.
But me beanie, Bob. You said it was cool and I need my beanie.
Bob sighed. He picked up the striped knitted object from the end of the bed and gave it to Sam, who adjusted it like a tea cosy over his bald pate and the tips of his ears.
Look all right?
You'll do. You can splash your face as we pass the basin. And hurry up. Arm in arm, once more, they set off to find what was left of breakfast and to discover what the rest of the day would bring. 2. Breakfast. The food had pretty much gone by the time the latecomers made it to the dining hall. They had a good 100 yards or so to go, Sam's stick tapping down the dormitory's limestone wall, across a covered walkway and along the hall veranda to the middle door. Despite the security of Tuppenny Bob's arm and his urgings to step on it, for the morning was bleak, the old chap liked to take his time and be sure of where he was going. He never trusted anybody else completely. It was the great lesson of life, and a mark that his individual human spirit was still kicking. Thus the porridge bowls had been scraped clean when they arrived, but there was still a last slice of bread and butter, and a little stewed tea to be squeezed out of the large enamel teapot on the far table. "Shove along, you lot," Bob instructed the unwilling occupants from the centre aisle. "Make a space for the old fella." He helped Sam take a seat on the long refectory bench, painted white with a high rail back to prevent any unstable residents from falling off, and stow it sharply to one man who reached out to grab the remaining bit of bread. "That's reserved." "Why?" "Because I said so. I got as much right to him as him. You've already eat some breakfast, Sammy ain't." The orderly placed the slice firmly in his hand. "Sorry about that," as he poured half a mug of lukewarm tea. Black, 2 sugars, a legacy from the bush.
"It's all right, Bob. I know what things can be like."
Certainly he did. Samuel Speed knew all about overcrowded mess rooms and hungry men fighting over crumbs. In the struggle for survival, only the self mattered, and this place was full. The home had been built to sleep 400 to 500 destitute old men in 3 rectangular accommodation blocks. Originally, they were all relics of pioneering days when men had far outnumbered women in the colony. But once the Depression started, there'd been half as many again. The wards had been crammed, blokes sleeping on verandas and even in humpies in the nearby bush, only coming inside to eat. Numbers had been dropping lately, but even so. And it wasn't just the aged and infirm either, but younger men like Bob, who'd lost his job and his home and everything, admitted by Albert Rust because he had nothing. One of many, their small sustenance benefits were paid into the home to help support them, with a little left over for the canteen and pub, plus their tuppences. It was decent of people like Albert Rust to do as much as they could to help those in distress. But that was the sort of man he was. Rust had started the Sunshine League to raise money for the needy and was Uncle Tom in the Daily News for the orphan children. But it was still charity, still a handout. And Samuel Speed knew that expectations of gratitude filled no stomachs. Indeed, for many men it only fed resentment, because hunger can make you do almost anything.
"Can't it just? You wouldn't be here otherwise."
He pushed the unwanted thought away and turned his almost sightless eyes down the white-painted table, where neighbours were still whinging about Sammy's purloined bit of bread. Sharp ears picked up muttered phrases, "It's not fair, should have come earlier," like so many upset birds on a roost settling their feathers. So, to provide a diversion, the old chap spoke up in his high, quavering voice.
You fellas know what's happening in the cricket?
It was a smart move. If there is any one thing that can unite Australians in riches or poverty, it is talk of sport, and especially during a test series of cricket. Attention turned immediately to the fifth at Kennington in faraway London. "Hutton's still smashing us," one fella said, two across from Sam and yesterday's booze still reeking on his breath. Sam had been teetotal for as long as he cared to remember and could smell it anywhere. "I found a newspaper in the rubbish bin. Triple century and close to beating Don Bradman's record," from further down.
"Yeah, but that were Tuesday," in Samuel's ear. "It's worse than that."
"Why?" a small chorus interrogated him. "What's happened?" "Bradman's hurt his foot. Slipped while bowling and out of it now. Tommy Senior hurt it overnight on his crystal set." Tommy had once run his own electric shop before he fell on hard times. "That's right," confirmed Tuppenny Bob. "It was on the wireless news this morning." And the conversation moved from crusts to a diagnosis of the mighty Don's injury, its cause, consequences and prognosis for the outcome of the 1938 Test Series, Bradman himself, and the very future of Australian cricket. This group of down-and-outers, reduced from whatever degree of former self-worth to penury and disgrace, animated for a little by the great leveller of cricket. No amount of money could buy the prowess of a Len Hutton or Jack Fingleton, let alone the Don, and anyone could express an opinion as good as the next man. Which they did, up and down the breakfast table and elsewhere in the hall. Samuel listened for a bit, munching his bread, for he liked the game, though he'd never actually played it. Eyes. And impoverished working-class boys like him didn't play cricket in those distant days. But whenever the tests were held in Australia, Sammy liked to listen in. The boss had bought the home's first wireless in the late 20s after a charity drive, a great contraption of a thing with a battery cabinet set up on the stage in the hall and a huge horn like a gramophone coming out of the top. Only Mr. Rust, of course, was allowed to fiddle the dials, but the inmates would sit on the benches listening to the broadcast of every over, the sound of bat on ball conveyed by the tap of a studio pencil, the fall of every wicket. And then a few years ago he'd raised the money to buy their first electric wireless. There was one in the recreation room you could listen to of an afternoon. But things were harder, except for the most dedicated with crystal sets, when the tests were in England, for the night bell would ring and lights out at 9 o'clock when the day's play in Pommyland had barely begun. Which was how Sam thought of it now. England, somewhere foreign, some other place with which Mr. Speed barely felt any connection.
"Except that you have to."
Shut up. And it wasn't just the wireless. Not long after he bought that first one, the boss built a projection room over the servery from the kitchen so they could show pictures. The silent ones at first, though they weren't of much use to Sam because they were just moving shadows accompanied by Mrs. Sheridan on the pianola. And then the new talkies when they came in. Mr. Rust persuaded some rich people to donate a yacht and a motor car for him to raffle and raised funds for the projector and all the sound equipment. The boss was a corker at that. And the home was the third place in Perth to show talking pictures. Twice a week at 6 o'clock after tea, and so much better because you could hear what was going on, even if the dialogue didn't mean a lot without vision and fellas got cranky if you asked what was happening. But there was always the music. What did they call it? The soundtrack. Better than the pianola. And Sam Speed loved music. It was one consolation for not being able to see much. He couldn't say he liked those jazzy jitterbug tunes they usually played on the radio nowadays. Too noisy, too energetic. They made you want to dance, and that was impossible on a walking stick, even if you could find a girl to dance with. No, but sometimes they would play nice things. An old-time waltz, say, or a song that meant something. Home, Sweet Home, if there'd ever been such a place, or Danny Boy. Remember? The concert parties that used to come out regular in the years before the war? Troops of young ladies and gentlemen, and a few older ones too, would hire a ferry from town, berth at the jetty down the embankment outside, and entertain them up there on the stage with songs and piano solos and comedy duets and recitations. Some of them are pretty good, too. Even Dame Nellie Melba came to the home once and sang to them because she supported the boss in his work. Not just with the old blokes, but the orphan kiddies as well. Though some of their entertainers could be hopeless. Remember that lot who came down with a beer keg on board? They were pickled when they arrived and got worse as the performance went on. Forgot their words, slurred their songs, tottered about the stage. It got so bad the audience started to leave, muttering insults and tripping people up with their crutches and wheelchairs. The boss had to bring the curtain down in the end, called the whole thing off. And the concert party was so offended they refused to stay for the special supper that he and Mr. Russ had prepared for them at the superintendent's house. Samuel laughed to himself. Such times! You didn't need to see very well to enjoy them, and most of the entertainment was up to a standard. Such a pity they hardly ever had a concert now, not since the pictures and the wireless. But when the concert parties did come, Bert Rust would often wade into the river with a tin tub tied to his waist, catching prawns and crabs and fish, enough to feed all his guests afterwards when the inmates had gone to bed. Such a considerate fella, the boss. Make life easy for the old men, and they'll make life easy for me, was the rule he ran the home by. Contentment all round. So very different to that arrogant booby, Mr. Wade, who'd been the first master here, as they called him then, and at the old Mount Eliza depot before that. The Perth convict depot it used to be, when Sammy first arrived on the Belgravia. Oh, how it will keep intruding. That fellow Wade, though, as one thought slid by association to another in the old man's mind, he carried on like the workhouse beadle, Mr. Bumble, in Oliver Twist. Truly. Sam knew the type from his youth. Even the newspaper called Wade a character out of Charles Dickens. He'd strut around in a swallowtail coat, high boots and cocked hat, an exacting disciplinarian to both deserving and undeserving poor alike. Cruel, too. He kept all the gates locked to stop inmates wandering through the bush and up to the pubs. It was like being back in prison again. Well, Albert Rust opened the gates, and they've never been shut since. That's what he meant yesterday about being generous to the old blokes, besides everything else, and it was true. I owe him a lot. We all do. Samuel let the observation percolate in his head. He didn't shove it away this time, but left it sitting, only half aware of the cricket chatter around him. Even if Hutton keeps on belting us, the series will still end in a draw. And considering that, if they were all in Mr. Rust's debt one way or another, then what followed? Only this. If he wants me to talk to this fella from the paper, well, it's the least I can do to help him. I've nothing else to give. No yacht or motor car, no money any more, and keep it sweet and simple, just like he advised. There. Sam had said it to himself, meant it, and come what may. The dining hall was emptying of men, voicing last-minute certainties on Bradman's ankle as they departed. Sam, too, got up slowly from the bench, feeling for his stick. Here you are, as Bob handed him the cane and prepared to take charge once more. He was under orders from the boss himself to look after the old fellow for the day. Spruce him up, attend to his needs, settle him ready for the interview. For the superintendent was well aware of Sam Speed's reluctance to provoke the ghosts of his convicted past, which some people would still find shocking. Understandably reticent. But Speed was the last one left who could remember from the inside. And if that might lead to a little public sympathy as well, and prize open a few more purses by way of donation, surely it would benefit everybody associated with the old men's home. In the 28 years Albert Rust had been running the place, he'd raised over £10,000 to improve the amenities. The cinema, 4-rink bowling green, The recreation room? He'd been a journalist himself in a former life, as well as a man who devoted himself to helping those in need, and Russ knew all about the mechanics of extracting money from the public in a good cause. Thus, he'd given Bob the orderly instructions to take particular care of Samuel. And first thing, after he'd eaten, was to attend to his toilet.
I don't think I need to go yet, Bob.
Well, we've got to go back to the dormitory to tidy up, fix your bed and whatnot. Why don't you make your way up there now? I'll nip over to the laundry store to get your clean sheets and meet you up there. We can decide then.
Rightio.
It took Samuel a lot longer to retrace his halting steps to the ward without Bob's guiding arm. A cool breeze was springing up from the river, and he could smell rain. But he relished the freedom of independent action, craved it, indeed. And he had all the time in the world. Sort of. They'd put Sam in the hospital here at the home for a few days when he returned from Perth last month, just to keep his hernia under observation. But he hated the restrictions. And then to the infirmary where the really frail-aged lived, reliant on help for everything. But Speed had insisted he return to a general dormitory near the hospital, just in case, where other Aldens like himself lived with some autonomy. In their twilight years, to be sure, but not yet utterly useless. And it was one step further away from the inevitable. Still, they weren't completely free of the need for some assistance, especially with all those little housekeeping chores that occupied this part of the morning, before the 9 o'clock bell sounded for the able-bodied who'd been assigned work to get started, and for the rest of them to find something to occupy the long hours of the day ahead. Some to go into the remnant scrub to relive for a little the old days, some to find their way to the nearest pub and offend the neighbours, some to play bowls or throw a fishing line from the jetty, some just to sit and think, and for one of them to confront the meaning of his long life. There were quite a few orderlies about the ward when Sam arrived. Bob was already among them, helping with the sheets and the white cotton bedspreads with a red stripe down the centre branded WAG to stop pilfering, tidying the bedside cupboards and removing bits of food that might be hoarded inside. That's why the bread was always buttered before it was put on the table. Some of the old uns would pinch the butter and any other eatables, leave it in their lockers, and forget about it until the stuff went rotten and stank, and then make a fuss when their posies were taken away. It was the result of many years living on hard rations.
Do you want me to give you a hand, Bob?
Samuel proffered his assistance, anxious to be useful still. Thanks, Sammy, but quicker by myself. Why don't you go outside and sit down for a bit?
If you say so.
He shuffled out the side door and found an empty chair among a few other ancients sitting on the veranda in the lee of the wind, but still catching a few patches of winter sun that slipped through the scudding clouds. They exchanged greetings and murmurs, but soon settled back into that silent inner world of old age, one that might seem solitary, but was in fact populated with far more incident and memory than the present could ever be. The sound of the orderlies going about their work indoors stole through the open windows. And to be honest, Samuel thought, the place would be nothing without them. Before the Depression, there'd been a paid staff of more than 40 people, including orderlies. But when things went bad, they were reduced to a handful, even as the numbers of inmates rose.
Whatever would we have done without tuppennies like Bob?
Samuel wondered. And as he sat in the shelter, contemplating a question to which he could provide no answer, he nodded and drifted into a snooze, made all the more pleasant after last night's broken sleep. Sammy, Bob was nudging his shoulder again. Having a little nap, eh? I'm ready for you now. The bathroom?
I still don't think I need to go, Bob.
I think you should try, Sam, in case. Don't want to have an accident afterwards, do we?
We?
Samuel felt himself start to bristle as Bob eased him up from the chair and led him towards the toilets and washrooms halfway along each side of the accommodation block. Why, he wondered, do people like nurses and orderlies always talk to children and the infirm in the plural? Was it power or just condescension? Either way, the old man disliked it, though he was as equally helpless to do anything about it. We? To be sure, it was a joint operation in the cubicle as they manoeuvred to get his trousers down and sit him on the porcelain. But still, Sam sat there, straining away with not much to show for it, and resenting this dependence. Talk about the bard's second childishness and mere oblivion. You finished yet?
Nearly.
Then the struggle recommenced to get him up, wiped and trousered again, and next propped by the basin to watch his face and hands with the flannel and soap. A mere splash from the dormitory basin would not suffice today. The water was warm, at least, always was, from the artesian bore.
Do we need a shave, Bob?
With just a hint of sarcasm.
Had one yesterday. Your face is still smooth as a baby's bum.
True. Even his stubble had stopped growing much nowadays. And staring at the pallid, distant reflection of himself in the mirror, as if through a haze, Samuel felt his irritation subsumed by some more immediate sensation in his guts. Nerves, probably, and the forthcoming interview. He tried to ignore the reporter's visit until breakfast time, but now that he'd made up his mind to go ahead with it, Sam began to worry if he'd not unwittingly agreed to appear before the Inquisition, like poor old Galileo, and wondered if he'd also condemn himself in the eyes of the world from his own mouth.
Oh, don't be silly. Just stick to the funny stories. Tell 'em about Moondine Joe. You've been doing that for years. What time did you say this chap is coming, Bob? And the Fenian's escape on the Catalpa. That always goes down well.
Mid-morning, I were told.
Ah. But what if he tries to make me confess things? What things? The truth of it.
Yes. Bob removed Samuel's beanie, passed a comb over his skull, and covered it again. We can go into the recreation room if you like, Sam.
I'd rather go to the library. They've got books there, and it's nice and quiet.
6,000 books, all collected from donations by the boss. Some had even been given by Sam himself when his eyes gave out. They had a few Braille ones, too, that the nice society ladies brought round on loan, with a couple of those new talking books besides. The library isn't open yet. Perhaps later. You could look at the paper in the rec room.
I can't read the morning one anymore, Bob. The West Australian print is too small, even with the glass.
There'll be yesterday's Daily News.
That's right. They have a good comic strip, eh?
And at that moment it occurred to Sam there was also a right way to consider the reporter.
He's only a journalist, not the flaming Pope.
Samuel brightened a little at that. Things would be fine, until the next thought reminded him that journalists are also trained to ask questions. Not very penetrating ones usually, but often quite personal and dogged if they sensed something was being hidden.
What if he takes me to places I don't want to revisit?
And they also carried a lot of weight. Look at the boss. He was still Uncle Tom in the paper, and not long ago persuaded the governor to give 2 full-size billiard tables from the vice-regal summer residence at Albany to the recreation room here at the home. Walter Lindrum had even given exhibition matches. That showed the extent of Bert Rust's influence. Samuel moistened his lips and his hand trembled a little. He'd been placed in this predicament by other people. And while he was still willing to help the boss, he began to wonder if there was anything he could do to restore the balance a little. Rather than passively allow himself to be chief witness at his own indictment, perhaps he might be able to tilt the situation slightly more in his favor. Vulnerable old men can sometimes be quite good at playing vulnerable old men. All ready, Sammy?
Good as I'll ever be, Bob.
Feeling all right?
A bit chilly, Bob. That breeze is right off the water, and there's not a lot of me, you know.
He sniffled and allowed a drop of moisture to dangle from the tip of his nose. "The walk will warm you up."
"Yes, I hope so."
They set off once more in the direction of the hall and recreation room, walking in silence apart from the stick and the wind and the patter of a passing shower on the iron roofs, until Sammy asked,
"What do you reckon that chap from the Mirror is doing now, Bob?"
But he didn't really care or expect any answer. Samuel Speed had conceived an idea. 3. The Journalist. As it happened, the journalist was himself out of sorts that morning. In part, it was a case of a new set of twins who had Joshua Cribben and his wife up half the night. One baby was screaming, and the other wasn't. And the dilemma that faced the inexperienced parents was, which infant is sick? They therefore picked them both up and walked around the tiny flat for hours, trying to pacify the one, reassure themselves that the other was yet alive, and mollify the neighbours. No sooner had they got back to bed than the other started crying, and the performance was repeated. Having waited through the worst of the Depression years until their early 30s to get married, Mr. and Mrs. Cribben were of sufficient age to be a little set in their ways, and found the trials of parenthood exhausting. Josh Cribben had consequently slept in, missed several buses, and arrived at the newspaper office to find that the photographer, with whom he was to get a lift to the old man's home at suburban Dalkeith, had already gone. "He's got several jobs on," said the chief of staff. "You'll have to take the bus." "Is there another office car?" "We've only got one, and that's spoken for." "It will take hours in the bloody bus." 30 minutes, replied the chief decisively. "And a nice ride. It's only Wednesday. We don't need your copy until Friday. I'd get cracking if I were you." Another irritation to add to Mr. Cribben's tiredness, and not much soothed by the chief of staff's parting words. "We plan to give it a decent run, you know, and expect a good job." "I always do a good job," the reporter muttered to himself, gathering his hat and coat again from the peg. "That's why you bloody hired me." Joshua Cribben had grown up in the country around 2J, northeast of Perth, left school at 14 and got a job with a local rag. Starting as a copy boy and general dog's body, as good newspapermen always did, he learned his trade from the ground up. Small paragraphs on the district's sports results and weather led to more substantial stories from the weekly stockyard sales, social events, the magistrates' court and shire council. Journalists on rural papers have to be adept at pretty much everything, by turn their own editors, secretaries, photographers and salesmen, and friends with everyone from the local mayor and policeman to the town drunk. Joshua thrived on it, and discovered that printer's ink flowed thickly in his veins. He learned the need for accuracy from his mistakes, as when he muddled the brides' names at 2 Saturday weddings and was threatened with legal action, or inadvertently killed someone in a motor accident who'd only been injured. "Dad's not dead. He's sitting up in bed with a bowl of soup." He developed a nose for news. A woman's routine application to the JP for a maintenance order against her estranged husband turned into a juicy scandal when the local priest offered Cribben a bribe not to report it. The story, in fact, led to his being recruited to the city and into another league altogether. But the young man had held his own, worked his way up through the grades on several newspapers until he'd ended up at the Weekend Mirror, where Joshua specialised in writing colour pieces and human interest stories. The rag was devoted to them, and the more colourful, human and interesting, the better. Which was why he'd been selected to interview Sam Speed at the Dalkeith Old Men's Home, said to be the last of the convict expirees still alive in the state. Cribben wasn't so sure how much colour or interest his readers would find in such a tale. Nude bathers arrested at midnight in the Dalkeith hot pool was more the Mirror style. Only a few months ago, the paper had led with exciting boil-over at the hot pool when 2 couples, each cheating on the other, had inadvertently gone swimming at the same time, recognised their partners, and began brawling in the water with fists and legs flying in the vimful battle, as the breathless scribe put it. and emerged wearing nothing but black eyes. Walking to St. George's Terrace to catch the bus, Joshua laughed out loud at the memory and wished he'd written it himself. The pool was on the riverbank, near a camping ground just down from the home. It had been formed some years ago when a pipe carrying hot artesian water up the embankment to the old men had broken. Hundreds of thousands of gallons had spilled out, creating a pleasure pond for bathers, especially for birthday suitors after dark, and a never-failing source of steamy hot coffee for the Mirror. The home had since had a pump installed, but perhaps, Cribben wondered, he could entice Sam Speed to tell tales of old men frolicking in the pool in a state of nature, just to spice the story up a bit. Then again, as he conjured up the vision, perhaps not. He bought the morning paper at the bus stop and stood bemused, as he always was, at the vast spread of classified advertisements that occupied the front and second pages of the West Australian. It was so old-fashioned. A sea of black ink with nothing to catch the reader's attention. No entertaining hijinks like the Mirror. Even something responsible to provoke alarm would help rouse interest. A strike, say, or the latest news from Europe, where Adolf Hitler was making trouble again. But nope, just ads. As Cribben turned the page and prepared to enter the bus, tucking the ticket safely in his wallet to claim against expenses, he noticed that Worth's Circus was in town. The twins would like that when they were a bit older. They just ball through it at the moment. Cassidy of Bar 20 with William Boyd was opening at the Grand, and Josh liked a good western. Perhaps Molly would be tempted for the weekend, though she'd probably want to see Maytime again with Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy. And who would look after the baby daughters? He would. On and on through the dense pages, Women's Realm, On the Land, local sports news, state parliament, two differing views from people affected by Hitler's takeover of Austria last March. One, a Jewish opera singer who'd escaped, had just arrived in Perth saying that Austria was like a cauldron stirred by witches. The other, a letter from an ecstatic German woman in the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, telling the world that Hitler knows but love and wants to make everybody happy. Tell that to the monkeys, Cribben thought. Anyone with half a brain could see that war clouds were gathering over Europe again. And here was the paper's editorial calling on the democracies, and especially the trade unions, to stand up to the dictators and get behind the rearmament program if another war was to be averted. They were right about that, even if Joshua Cribben, feature writer, knew in his bones that within a year or two he'd be filing altogether more serious articles as a war correspondent. The bus jolted through the city streets towards Mounts Bay Road. Oh, here on page 20 was something. A daring double-column intro and a bold four-stave headline. Record score. Hutton makes 364. Bradman injured. A hopeless position. Page 20. Cribben gave a small, contemptuous, journalistic guffaw. He knew what the Daily News would splash this afternoon. He looked out the window. It was a pleasant enough drive, certainly, even on a damp, overcast day. The road skirted the river, the rippling waters of the Swan on one side, the winter green of King's Park on the other, then past the Swan Brewery site. If Joshua remembered from his reading in for the story, the convict depot had once been near here, later used for destitute old men. Well situated for the drunks among them, and a reason, apart from the prime value of the land, it had been moved 30-odd years ago. Past the university, the bus emptying of students, and into the suburbs. Rather posh, expensive suburbs they were too. Crawley, then Nedlands, with Claremont a little further to the coast. Dalkeith and the old men's home on an exclusive 22 acres high above the riverfront near the point. The place had been quite isolated when first built in 1906, surrounded by bushland on three sides, with the nearest houses and pubs a good mile away. But since the Great War, the streets and modern brick residences of suburbia had encroached up to it. Increasingly pricey residences too, built for people attracted by the water views, easy distance to town, and proximity to the coastal beaches and Fremantle. prospering people to whom the presence of the home and so many destitute old men among them was an unceasing embarrassment. Josh Cribben laughed to himself again. This suburban angst was another source of good copy for the Mirror. Residents were always writing to the authorities complaining about intoxicated old men on the streets. He used the Claremont tram shed as a lavatory, swearing and shouting in public, and demanding proper supervision of the inmates. Worrying that their land values would be diminished if the place gained an unsavoury reputation. Fat chance of that, Cribben thought, with houses here selling for £1,300 and more, well above anything he and Molly could afford. One upset householder had even written to the minister a few years ago, saying it was most objectionable for anyone to have a look at an old man in the street with some kind of paralysis, and even worse if he was in liquor. Of course, Albert Rust defended his charge by observing that some of the drunks were not his inmates, that the home was not a prison, and once the old men were outside the gate, they were as free as any other citizen and could be arrested if they committed an offence, which they quite often were, and Rust had to spend a day in court to have them returned to his care. From a newspaperman's point of view, this battle between virtue and vice was always an entertaining exercise in conflict journalism. And from the Mirror's particular angle, it offered, like the hot pool down the road, an opportunity to at once report scandalous goings-on in shocked tones and mock the pious self-interest of the respectable classes. Hypocrisy has ever driven a printing press. "Next stop, sir," as the bus slowed on Birdwood Parade. "Thanks." And just as he was getting off, Cribben remembered there was a wooden hut at the home said to have come from the original convict depot near the brewery where the worst of the derelict old men were supposed to be housed. Perhaps, if nude bathing was out, he could persuade Samuel Speed to tell him a few yarns about drunken brawls among the Darrows instead. Sam had spent a good half-hour in the recreation room, coughing and blowing his nose and mounting crescendo, as he stooped over yesterday afternoon's newspaper with a magnifying glass and his almost useless spectacles. Much of it was sport, largely the disasters of the fifth test compounded in his mind by the news at breakfast time. But the headlines were large and easy on his semi-good eye. Something about Franco, the new bridge being built at Fremantle. There was a big photo on the back page of a little boy marching beside the King's Guards in London. That was nice. And a cartoon about finding a missing necklace under a fat woman's double chin. Not a problem skinny Sam Speed had ever faced. But otherwise, the writing on the Popeye comic strip was getting just too small, and the same for Brick Bradford. Samuel looked around to where Bob was practicing a shot at the governor's billiard table, saw his opportunity, and all of a moment he sneezed loudly, once, twice, sniffled extravagantly, and fell back into his chair. "Are you all right, Sammy?" Bob put up his billiard cue and came over to the table by the window.
"Think so, Bob. I just had a little turn there," he sneezed again, "and feeling the cold."
"Well, let me have a look at you. You got a hanky?"
"In me pocket,"
for his nose was running again. Bob felt for a handkerchief, found it rather mucky, and used a fairly clean one of his own. "How you feeling now?"
"A bit better, thanks, Bob. Sorry to interrupt your billiards. I know how you like them."
"That's all right."
"Remember when the boss played a game here with Walter Lindrum and won? Though, of course, Lindrum gave him a 400 start in a 401 game."
Another cough and a heavy sniff.
"I don't know what come over me, Bob."
Though, of course, he did. "Are you all right for this interview? Still feel up for it?"
"Oh, I think so, Bob. Think so. Just a little giddy there. Except..."
"What is it, old-timer?"
"Well, I'm feeling rather chilly. The breeze and that last shower, you know. And the heating's none too flashing here during the daytime."
"No better in the library, neither."
"I know. The only really warm place for these old bones is back in bed."
"Bed? You want to go back to bed?"
Yes. How'll this bloke talk to you in bed? Take your photo? He can sit beside me in a chair, Bob. I'll be warm, he'll be comfy, and we'll both be pretty private. Not many people about in the ward at this time of day.
What will the boss say?
You'd better ask him, Bob.
After another dramatic sneeze and wheeze,
if I have to stay out here in the cold, I don't reckon I'm up for talking to anybody at all. Not today, and worried about another turn. It's me ticker. I think you'd better tell that to Mr. Rust as well.
So it was. When Joshua Cribben arrived at the old men's home, he was taken first to the superintendent's office, then to the ward in Block C, where he found Samuel Speed in his nightshirt, flannel and knitted beanie, a shawl around his shoulders, courtesy of the infirmary, and cradling a mug of tea, sitting tucked up in bed and waiting. "Sorry about this," Albert Rust explained as he walked his visitor up to the ward. "But the old chap felt the weather this morning, the cold snap." "That's all right," Cribben replied. "It will help to give the story a bit more colour to see him in his, habitat." "Overexcitement, I suspect," the super smiled. "I had the nurse look at him, take his temperature, fuss about him a bit. She says he's fine. You have to expect these things at his age." "What is Sam's age?" the journalist asked, hoping to establish the basic bread-and-butter facts at the outset. "Well, that's rather an elastic commodity." Rust's genial good humour broadened into a laugh. "I've seen it put variously at 92, 98, and even 105. We generally reckon around 95. "I'll ask him." "By all means. But he's often a bit vague about his early days. Understandable, of course, looking back over 9 decades, and perhaps there are some things he'd rather not remember. Forgetfulness can be a great blessing." "Hello, Sam," Albert Rust called as they entered the long ward. It smelt strongly of calcimine paint on the plaster walls and carbolic soap on the floor. And as they walked down the double row of beds, "This is Mr. Cribben from the paper, come to see you."
"How's it, Mr. Cribben?"
A thin but supple voice greeted him from the skull under the knitted nightcap.
"You come with your list of questions like a policeman."
"Just a little chat, Sam, about the old days. Something to interest our readers." Joshua took the bird-like claw proffered from beneath the shawl. "A few reminiscences, like we talked about," the boss reminded.
"Then why don't you sit yourself down on the chair here beside me so I can see you with me good eye?"
The journalist removed his hat and coat, pulled a reporter's notebook from his jacket and a pencil from his shirt pocket. "Would you like me to stay?" Rust asked, a little uncertain what Samuel might say.
No,
both subject and interlocutor hastened together.
"I've got Bob here if there's anything I need,"
the old man added. Rust turned to the reporter. "Then call in to see me when you go. There might be a few outstanding things I can help you with, one journalist to another, and give you a cup of tea."
"Bob's already brought me a mug from the infirmary,"
Samuel piped up.
"And a biscuit."
"Thanks," Cribben replied to Rust. "I'll do that. And could you show the photographer up here when he arrives? I hope to get a lift back to town with him." "Certainly," as the boss departed down the ward. The hat and coat deposited on one adjacent bed, and Bob the tuppenny orderly watching proceedings from the other. Josh Cribben opened his notebook to a clean page and sat down on the bedside chair, from where Samuel Speed was gratified to observe he was a good head higher than his interrogator, and hoped he cut a pathetic figure, for he'd removed the dentures to give his face a gaunt, collapsed appearance and to blur the words a little. "When were you born, Sam? First things first."
"I were born in Birmingham in 1840,
Speed replied, sounding very confident. He thought about what he should say. "So that would make you, 98? Josh Cribben used his fingers, and numbers were not his strong suit.
"Something like that, if you say so."
There was a pause as Cribben wrote it down.
"Birmingham is a place in England," Sam added helpfully. "Pommyland."
"I know.
A big town, even in those days. Lots of factories, chimneys belching smoke and steam. Well, it's on the edge of the Black Country. Coal pits and ironstone mines.
Do you have any family, Sam?
I had a brother and a sister. She got married and lived in Birmingham too.
Parents?
Yes, I had parents.
Pause.
A mother and a father.
He tried to picture them, but the faces were faded and blurred almost beyond recognition, like an image dissolving back into the metallic surface of a tintype photograph.
They were working people. It were hard work in the pits and mills. But they always took us children to Sunday school, chapel in those days. That's where I learned my letters.
And came to the fragment of a workhouse, a hard bench in a schoolroom, and a severe woman with a stick as he read out loud from his primer.
A is for apple, B is for book, C is for...
The stick striking the back of his hand to hurry him up with cat. But Samuel was very small, and he wouldn't mention that. So he said instead,
I like a good book. Do you read, Mr. Cribben?
Have to in my trade, Sam. More than is good for me, sometimes.
You can never have too many stories. Dickens has always been a favourite.
Great Expectations. And Magwitch, the terrifying convict lying hidden in the marshes, though he was to come much later. As a child, Samuel learned enough of his letters to read the simpler text hanging in the grimy workhouse, repeating over and over the shorter syllables, the, n, suffer the children, and God is love above his cot. Sufficient to recite the Lord's Prayer by rote and even to follow some of the easier words painted large on the chapel wall. Our Father, which art in heaven. Did you keep in touch with your family, Sam?
Well, my parents died.
Much safer to return from his father and mother in heaven to this world.
A hard life, like I said. And we all had to go out to work at an early age. Some of the pit boys, were only 9 or 10, younger. But I didn't like it underground. I got afraid.
Claustrophobia?
That's it. Little boys and girls in the darkness for 12 hours a day, pushing heavy coal trucks down narrow passages where the ponies couldn't go. It were terrible. They wouldn't know what it was like these days.
No, indeed. They passed a law against it.
Yes, but that didn't stop them. Not where we were, not when I was young.
So what did you do?
Oh,
Samuel sought to look down the vista of the sepia-coloured years.
I couldn't stand the mines, Mr. Cribben, or the factories. I needed space, open air, and then I hurt me eye.
He turned the blind optic towards his visitor. How did that happen?
Don't know properly. A stone chip flying up. I can still see that carriage going hell for leather down the road and the gravel flying. Something like that. An accident, anyway. And it left me with a scar under me ear and unable to see a lot out of the left peeper. Oh, I could still read a bit, and there was the good eye. Any interesting little pieces from the penny magazines, if I found one lying about in the street and the words weren't too hard. Especially if it had pictures. But it was no good in the pits or the mills. As soon as I could, I left Birmingham and found work on the farms. I liked that. Out in the fields with the plough and horses or bringing in the crops. That was lovely in a good year. A big harvest home in the barns with a fiddler and dancing and everything.
He could see the revels still in pale shades of brown and black and white. Funny that these memories had no other colour in them.
I was never a very big lad, but it put meat on me bones and roses in me cheeks.
You still see your brother and sister at all?
Oh, sometimes if it weren't too far, I'd get a ride with the wagon into Birmingham to see my married sister. But then not so often as I began to grow up and had to find work further afield. There were some bad years, and I was on the road a lot, out past Warwick, down towards Banbury in Oxfordshire. So no, I didn't see her much then. And after that came my trouble, and I've never seen my brother nor my sister since.
What happened, Sam?
So, now we come to it. Magwitch, in his prison rags and irons, seizing Pip in an overgrown graveyard and snarling, "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat," scaring the boy half to death.
Can you tell me about it? And through the smoke-grey clouds of memory came the sudden strike and flare of a scarlet flame.
This is the end of CD 1. The book continues on CD 2. CD 2.
Four. Fire. Sam, can you tell me about it? Cribben asked once more into the long silence.
There's nothing much to tell. A pal and I set fire to a stack of barley in a field at Woodstock, near Oxford. Got caught.
Rick burning was taken pretty seriously in country parts, Cribben knew. Certainly was around 2J. The journalist's nose sensed the making of a storyline. Was it a political act, Sam? Were you and your mate protesting against the government? Against the Corn Laws? The new machines?
No, young fella, nothing like that. It was because we were starving.
Sam allowed another small silence to fall between them. Before going on,
We wanted to go to prison, to get something to eat, regular meals like.
Oh, was that all? Joshua felt the story slipping away from him. No grand, defiant gesture here. No heartless landlords or cruel tyranny. Samuel Speed was no Luddite, just another criminal.
And I suppose you could say,
the old chap waved any further discussion away with a laugh,
that we got what we asked for. Years of meals provided courtesy of the government.
And he sipped the lukewarm dregs of hospital tea in his mug. So few words. So much left unspoken behind them. Nothing much to tell, or would tell. Yet in his mind, Sam travelled that whole livelong day again. He could see the disappointment in Cribben's eyes that he had not something more newsworthy to tell his readers. But in that one day, on that one act, turned the whole pivot of his life. Striking a match and setting it to the barley stack had led Samuel Speed to 72 years' exile from his native land. And he was back there now, tramping the slippery road from Bladen Village that Saturday afternoon in early August 1863. Sam and his mate, Tommy Jones, a baker with the army who'd lost his place some weeks ago. The two of them so hungry from lack of work and money that every step felt a burden. And there was Tommy cooking up such vivid pictures of currant buns with icing and bread smoking hot from the oven you could almost eat his words, until they dissolved the moment Samuel reached out to take them. Would they never get a job? Anything would do. Just a few shillings in the pocket, or even a good meal from a farmer's wife to fill the stomach in return for helping with the pigs or the haystooks. But the answer was always the same. Nothing. Only half an hour ago, the two had gone into a yard back down the road, the dogs barking and the farmer eyeing them suspiciously as they came through the gate. Sammy couldn't blame him, not in retrospect, for the two young men were both pretty ragged and not very clean. Shifty, too, for when you are desperate, the desperation always shows.
"We were wondering, sir, if you was looking for a couple of hands about the place."
The two had not been together long, but being the elder and a former military man, he usually took the lead. "Both good workers. Sorry, but I have all the help I need. Strong, willing, useful in the fields. Barley's already in," the farmer countered, "and wheat's not ready to cut. Been a poor start to summer. Milk the cow for you. Bit of thatching, drainage. I told you." The man became threatening, for he knew a couple of vagabonds when he saw them. "I've got all the help I need." "We've got nothing," young Samuel pleaded. "Then the Union Workhouse is just up the road at Woodstock. Built for people like you. We've been there before, and they sent us on our way." "Well, go somewhere else. Now be off with you and close the gate." The same everywhere. And to be sure, Samuel knew the summer had not started very well. The farmer spoke truly there. Spring had been fine. Good rain and a little warmth for ploughing and sowing, and work had been reasonably plentiful for an itinerant labourer in Oxfordshire. The farmers had even been talking of a bumper year. But then had come a long, dry spell, and word along the wayside and even in the weekly paper, when Sam found a torn page, turned to fears of drought. Not, as he was to know, months, years of drought in Western Australia, but bad enough, in English terms, to raise concerns for the harvest. The wheat so far had been soft and unripe, the meadow grass without rain slow to grow for haymaking. And so, in the nature of things, the casual rural work Speed depended upon had also dried up. The 30 shillings he'd been able to save began to evaporate as well. Sam set his face down the road from Banbury, his few possessions tied in a bundle, like the swags of later years. He was lucky to get a short day's work from time to time, but mostly it was sleeping rough in the hedgerows or under stacks and eating quite literally into his little store of reserves, until his money had almost gone. And being young, still in his teens, whatever Samuel told the journalist Cribben, his youthful self-confidence had started to fail with it. It was about this time, in late July, that Samuel fell in with the unemployed baker, Tommy Jones. Tom Jones, another scallywag from his stories. At 24 and formerly with the Royal Engineers, Tommy had much more experience of life. They got on together, pooled what little they had, shared the crusts of daily bread and half-pints of small beer they were able to buy, went halves with the few coins they managed to beg and the odd jobs they scrounged. But it was never enough for one man, let alone two. And by the time they reached the market town of Woodstock, Speed and Jones were both utterly destitute. Their only recourse was to the Woodstock Union Workhouse, which they found a short way up a lane leading off the high street. It was a large, 2-story building in the local stone, glowing a soft dun colour in the sunlight, constructed on a kind of elongated H plan, one end wing for women, the other for men. The reception area, masters' rooms and offices in the middle, the dining hall, facilities, and another accommodation block behind. It was not much more than 20 years old, with recent additions, having been built at the time when responsibility for the poor laws shifted from individual parishes to collective groups of them known as unions, the new and larger workhouses sheltering the poor from a much wider district under an elected board of governors. They also had some room for itinerant travellers in want, such as Speed and Jones, vagrants as they were generally known, and the master allowed them to stay for a few days. "Thank you, sir. We're very grateful to you." "Mind you," the master went on, "you will have to look for work while you're here. We're pretty full as it is with our own people. If you found nothing after 3 or 4 days, you'll have to move on." Whatever the broader intent behind the reformed poor laws, in practice they were still guided by a parochial spirit. Each union took care of its local indigents supported by the poor rate, and strangers, outsiders, who did not contribute, were not wanted. But for Sam and Tom Jones, they had at least several days' respite. They'd missed midday dinner, but they slept that first night in a dormitory with a number of other homeless men, having a little bread and cheese in their stomachs, rich as any Christmas feast after the hunger they'd known. Yet work in town was nowhere to be found for them. Not for a baker with such undoubted gifts as Tommy possessed, nor for a willing young jobbing labourer like Sam. They went down byways into the countryside around, knocking on farm doors and even cottages, but the answer was unvarying. Nothing available. At length the workhouse master told them their time was up and they'd have to leave in the morning. "I should try the Oxford Road if I were you. Most of the other fellows head there. Bigger place." But the pair had already been down the main thoroughfare a little way without any success, and it seemed foolish to follow everybody else along a bleak path to disappointment. Thus, a mile out of town the next morning, they decided to turn down the road that led to Blaydon and the villages beyond. The problem was, however, that the road skirted the Blenheim estates of the mighty Duke of Marlborough, and most of the farmers were his tenants. Indeed, Sam and Tommy passed the imposing entrance gates as they left Woodstock, just near the police station, and could see down the long drive to the vast Baroque stone pile of Blenheim Palace, said to be the greatest house in England. Inspired by Versailles, Blenheim was so grand that envy was beside the point. They had, in fact, already been to the estate office asking for work, but the Duke, or his agent, gave preference to local employment, especially in lean times. There was nothing for a couple of vagrants when so many of their own were in need, and this rule followed them all the way down the Blaydon Road. For nearly 2 days, Speed and Jones had barely eaten, except for the few scraps they'd been able to save from their workhouse rations. To add to their misery, it started to rain at last. Good for the crops and the prospects for future work, but at present all it did was wet them through until eventually they had no choice but to turn around and head back towards Woodstock. Through Blaydon and past St. Martin's Church, where members of the Duckle-Churchill family were buried, closing one more farmer's gate as the dogs were almost set upon them. "I told you, I've got all the help I need." "We've got nothing." And thus, with hunger-driven steps, the pair reached the Oxford Road again. By rights, they should have turned towards the university town, but that was 10 miles away, and Woodstock was only 1. "We've got to go back to the workhouse," Tommy said. "But they told us to go." "It's late and we're starving. They'll have to take us in, at least for the night." "I don't know about that." "Come on!" And with Jones in command, they headed back towards Woodstock. The two hadn't gone very far when they met a townsman, a youngish man like themselves, but in altogether happier circumstances, walking the other way. He worked as an assistant in a drapery store and was coming home that Saturday afternoon to a wife and child with a week's wages in his pocket. Church tomorrow at St. Andrew's. "Excuse me, sir," Jones began, "but would you be able to spare us a little change? We've not eaten for 2 days. "I haven't very much," the man hesitated, for draper's assistants were not paid a fortune. "Anything, please," Samuel begged. "Wait a moment." Remembering his duty of Christian charity, the young man fumbled in his pocket and produced a halfpenny. "I'm sorry, it's all I can spare. I have a family depending on me." "Thank you, sir. We're grateful to you." "Very." At least they could buy one of those currant buns with icing to eat. But Jones cautioned against spending it too quickly. They'd go back to the workhouse first, get a bed for the night and supper, and keep the halfpenny against future requirements. Yet the workhouse was not as accommodating as Tom Jones had supposed. Night was closing in by the time they arrived, and the master was away for the evening, attending a private dinner in town. But one of the porters, Charles Ferraby, was on duty in the vestibule when Speed and Jones rang the bell at the front door. He opened it, and by the light that shone on their faces from the hall lamp recognized them at once. "Oh, it's you two, is it?" he growled. A workhouse inmate himself once, who owed his present employment entirely to the master's goodwill, Charlie Ferraby was wise to every trick in the repertoire of indigence. He'd done them all. "You both back again? What you want?" "We need a bed for the night, something to eat." "We've given you a bed and fed you for several nights already. Master's told you to go, said to make for Oxford." "We went down the wrong way." "Then more fool you. But you won't fool me. Go on, you've been told to leave." "Just one night, please. Where's the master?" "Master's out." "Then who's in charge?" "I am. I do what the master says, and I'm telling you, get off!" And he slammed the solid wooden door in their faces. Sam Speed and Tom Jones stood on the workhouse step for a few moments, not knowing quite what to do. Rejection and despair had so reduced their natural spirits that the mind seemed unable to grasp the enormity of their situation or suggest any possible way out.
"Tommy," Samuel whispered low, almost with a whimper. "What now?"
He felt as if he wanted to curl himself up small and cry, as he had as a child into his mother's lap. Or worse, as many a sheep about to go under the butcher's knife ceased all struggle and resigned itself limply to fate.
"What are we going to do?"
"I don't know. Yet." Tommy tried to kick his more adult mind to some kind of motion. What would the Royal Engineers do in this emergency?
"We could use the halfpenny to buy a couple of plain buns," Samuel said at length. "There's a shop open in the High Street. Find shelter in a barn somewhere," for the rain was threatening once more.
"No," Tommy Jones was anticipating things more quickly. "No, Sammy, I got a better idea."
"What?"
"Move a ways up the lane here," for he'd spied Charlie Ferriby looking at them through the lighted window. "The thing is, Sammy, if we buy a currant bun with that halfpenny now, it might last us the night. But what about tomorrow? And the day after tomorrow? We'll be no better off, back where we are now."
"So?"
"If the workhouse won't have us," how like Oliver Twist he sounded as Samuel, in his old man's bed, heard Tom Jones speak down the kaleidoscope of years. "If they won't give us something to eat, there's only one place that will."
"Where's that, Tommy?"
"Prison. They've got to feed you there. Government regulation. Meat and potatoes and cocoa and half-a-pound loaf of bread a day. I know, 'cause I'm a baker.
Hot soup?
Such a feast of piping food Tommy's words had conjured up.
"The police station's just down the lane. Will we ask them there?"
"It don't work like that, silly. You got to do something wrong first. Get yourself arrested."
"What sort of wrong?"
Vague memories of the 10 Commandments came back to Samuel from his childhood days in Sunday school.
"Break a window? Pinch something?"
"Thou shalt not steal" painted on the wall next to the Lord's Prayer. "Not sure we're up to that, Sammy. I hardly got enough strength left to chuck a brick. But there is something."
"What's that?"
"The other day I noticed a stack of barley in a field just along of here. If we was to spend that halfpenny on a box of matches and set fire to the rick, they'd have to arrest us then."
"And give us a meal in jail?"
"Yeah, quite a few meals, actually."
"They serve you with a long sentence, eh?"
But his humour fell flat, especially with the arrival of second thoughts.
"I don't know, Tommy. It seems to be taking things a bit far. We could be in real trouble."
Samuel tried to remember if "thou shalt not set fire to a barley rick" also appeared in the 10 Commandments, but he could not visualize it on the painted list. "Have you got a better idea, then?" Jones suddenly turned on the lad with a savagery bred of hunger that Sam had not heard before. "If so, spit it out."
"No, I don't know."
His resistance had been brought so low by the shock of Ferriby and distress that in the moment Samuel couldn't formulate anything much by way of an idea at all. "Then are you in with me or not? If you are, say so. If not, shove off and go your own ways by yourself." His defences quite demolished by Tommy's violent words, Speed could only surrender and give his assent. Now, with a plan of action in mind, they traced their steps back down the lane, moving very quietly in the shadows past the workhouse and the porter's lamp-lit window, creeping by the narrow stone houses at the end, until they turned into the High Street. The shop was still open. They went in, resisting the display of currant buns. Jones asked for a small packet of lucifer matches, handed over the halfpenny, and the pair returned as quietly as they'd come along Hensington Lane. Soft their footsteps might have been, but Samuel's heart was beating in his breast like a hammer. This was the first truly bad thing, the first crime he'd have committed in his life. And here, on the brink of it, the incendiary voices of guilt and fear from chapel, desperation and survival in the present were clashing inside his head. What would happen? Would he be hanged, perhaps? Transported? Whipped? Who could tell? But at least, sweet reason soothed, it would be with a full belly. Turn back, discordant conscience warned. But it was too late. for already they were past the workhouse and standing at the barred wooden gate that led into a field where stood the barley stack, silhouetted dark against the sky. "Will I stay here and keep watch?" Sammy asked, a last feeble struggle against sin as Jones undid the peg and the gate swung wide. "No, you come with me, boy. We're in this together, remember?" Footsteps crossed the damp grass to the rick. Hands rummaged past the outer stook to a dry place further in where the rain had not penetrated. And with an evil yellow flare, the first match was struck and set among the tinder. A smouldering moment of hesitation. Another flash. Then it caught and licked a crimson tongue of flame into the darkness. Flickering as a serpent and hissing with joy as it fed, the spark slid from one stalk to another, spitting and spreading dragon fire until the barley began to burn with its own delight. A plume of thin, white smoke spiraled upwards, quickly filling as the stack ignited and became a vast cloud, a thing of nightmares, threatening and storming in memory, lit by lightning and cinders and roaring flames. "Oh, Christ! What have we done?" But Tom Jones merely turned to the lad and laughed. "Now, Sammy, we can go to the police station." A few minutes later, Charles Ferriby happened to look out of his window again to see if those two vagrants had gone, noticed a curious orange glow in the night, and going outside, saw the blaze. He at once raised the alarm, shouting, "Fire! Fire!" into the street, and running back inside began to ring the workhouse bell. By the time Tom Jones and Sam Speed reached the end of the lane, the cry had already been taken up, and people were running towards them. "Bring buckets! Call out the fire car! Joe Haynes' rick is on fire! We'll catch who did this! Hurry, hurry now! We'll get 'em!" "But Tommy, it wasn't me," Samuel whispered when they were round the corner and out of earshot. The magnitude of what had just happened, and its consequences, began to bear upon him, far more terrifying than even the prospect of starvation had been. "I never done it. I never lit no match." "Oh, yes, you did. You were with me, young Sammy." Jones turned and, seizing the lad by the throat, pushed him roughly against the wall. "You had your chance to git. You stayed. You were as much part of it as me. And if you try to peach on me, Samuel Speed, I will tell the police it was you who begged the halfpenny. It was you what suggested the matches. It was you that threw 'em away back up the lane. And I'll show 'em where. You understand that, boy?" Yes, Tommy. But I never did." "Well then, I hope you do." He released the lad, still shaking, and together they crossed the Oxford Road and walked towards the police station, where they waited outside, summoning the last bit of courage required to go inside. It was then that Inspector Lewis Coates came out of the building, buttoning up his jacket. He'd heard the alarm and, quickly finishing his tea, was on his way to investigate when he saw the pair standing by the stoop. "What do you two want? Is it about the fire?" "Yes, sir," Jones spoke first. "What can you tell me about it?" "Well, just to say we done it." "You lit the fire? Where?" "Stack of barley, up past the workhouse there." "And what did you do with the matches?" "Threw 'em away, on the road, just outside the gate." "And you," the inspector turned to Samuel Speed, "were you involved with this too?" "Yes, sir." "And you're turning yourselves in? Why?" "Because we're starving. The workhouse turned us away, and we've nothing to eat." "I see." Inspector Coates drew his breath. He'd rarely solved a case quite so quickly. "Well then, you'd better come with me." And he escorted them inside the police station. He took their statements and particulars, which they signed, for both Samuel and Tommy could write their names, albeit rather slowly and awkwardly. Samuel even made a careful show of reading his statement first. Words like rick, matches, and fire were easy enough. Workhouse he could mouth to himself phonetically, even if things like Ferriby and feloniously tossed him. Still, Samuel understood the gist of it and attached his name to the paper and ink. "Can we get some food now?" There were still the last procedures to complete. Inspector Lewis formally laid charges of suspected arson against each man, and deciding to go up the lane with a lantern to look for the box of matches, told his sergeant to lock them in the cells. Though, supper having already been served, Tom Jones and Sam Speed had to remain hungry until morning, with only the crumbs of self-doubt and recrimination to feed them for the first night of their long incarceration. 5. Trial.
"We should have bought that bun,"
Aged Samuel Speed murmured softly, almost inaudibly, to himself. It takes pages to write it down, but mere seconds for memory to relive the whole experience and return Sam to his bed in the ward in the old men's home, with some other young fella, a reporter, asking the questions. "What was that, Sam? You want a bun?"
"Eh? No, nothing like that. Bob brought me a sweet biscuit already," with a laugh.
Joshua Cribben looked down at his notebook, just like that Inspector Lewis. "So, you handed yourself in and went to court. Where was that, Sam? And the sentence?"
"We were taken to Oxford Castle. The judge gave us 7 years, and we knew at once that meant transportation."
"How?"
"Anything under that, you served your time in England. Otherwise it was bye-bye."
So lightly the words floated between them, borne on the wings of Sammy's little chuckle and caught on the tip of Mr. Cribben's pencil. So quick and easily spoken. But how to convey, even if he wished to, the sense of dread that hung over both Speed and Tom Jones as they realized the full weight of the law descending upon them once they turned themselves in to the Woodstock police? To be sure, after that first ravenous night in the lockup, breakfast had been brought to them. Thin porridge, a slice of bread and a mug of lukewarm tea, no worse than any workhouse meal they'd eaten, and considerably more satisfying after almost 3 days without anything apart from rainwater. The hard bench and dingy surroundings were familiar enough from other doss houses, and a lot more comfortable than sleeping under brambles in the wet. It was only when they saw the morning light through the high barred window and watched the iron shadows cast by the rising sun creep across the stone wall that they grasped, really understood for the first time, they were not free to go outside into the day. A solid door strapped and studded, a metal lock without a key, and an observation slot stood between them and the freedom of the open road. And this was the price of the porridge they'd just eaten to stave the pains of starvation.
"Tommy, what do you think will happen to us?"
Sammy asked as his mind sought to adjust to these new circumstances in his life.
"What will they do?"
"I'm not sure, boy," Jones replied, speaking softly. "I've never been in this situation afore. But I'll tell you one thing," and a sense of urgency crept low into his voice. "You remember what I told you outside."
"Promise, Tommy, I won't peach on you."
"I know you won't," with a small gloat. And then, more seriously, "I meant the other." For standing at the threshold of the police station last night, just before Inspector Lewis appeared, Jones had taken sudden pity on the lad. He'd frightened Samuel enough to acknowledge his part in the crime, and by way of reparation he offered the lad a little advice. "Listen, Sammy, I don't know how old you really are. I don't care. But whatever it is, you tell 'em you're 18. Got it? 18. The law can be very cruel to youngsters."
"How cruel?"
"Never mind. Just remember what I said." And so, in the cell that first morning, Jones reiterated his words. 18. Remember it. "I won't forget." Thereafter, whatever his true age, Samuel Speed was forever branded on the official records as being 18 years old at the time of his arrest and trial. That first day, being Sunday, they were kept in the cell, from where they could hear church bells ringing, fragments of hymn singing and prayers, no doubt being said for the comfort of Joseph Hines, the victim of last night's arson attack and a popular local man who ran a good inn. Not much, Samuel assumed, by way of solace for his soul, however penitent he now felt with something solid in his guts. Not until the following morning were they handcuffed. "My first pair," Sammy joked to Tom Jones to keep up spirits, and they were taken to Inspector Lewis again. "I went up Hensington Lane and found the packet of matches where you said you threw them," he said, stern of voice. "I consider that proof enough of your statements that you lit the fire. And we have evidence from Ferriby, the porter, that he saw you both standing outside the workhouse and going towards Hines Gate shortly before the blaze broke out. The charges, therefore, will be upgraded from suspicion to the fact of arson." "Yes, sir." "I can tell you," the detective went on, leaning back in the chair and putting his fingers together in an attitude of official sanctity, "there is quite a strong feeling here over Saturday night's fire. Mr. Hines is well liked. If this were America, from all I've read of that country, we might well have a lynch mob after you by now." He paused to allow the effect of those words to do their work. And when Lewis could see they had done so, he added, "However, fortunately, this is not America, fighting a murderous civil war, but a peaceable, law-abiding nation. Nevertheless, I think it would be better for everybody, including yourselves, if you were removed to Oxford as soon as possible."
"Oxford? We're going to university?"
But Inspector Lewis's next words were no laughing matter. "I've therefore arranged for the magistrate to convene a sittings today, where you'll be arraigned. You won't be required to plead, but will request you be remanded in custody to a later session of the assizes at Oxford. You should be in the castle prison by late this afternoon." So it transpired. Rain had come on again as the horses pulling the covered police transport, the Black Maria, splashed their way down the last of the Woodstock Road and began to rumble with the ominous sound of drums over the cobbled streets of the ancient university town. Speed and Jones, sitting cuffed and hobbled in the back, could see nothing very much except the receding view of buildings through the small, grated rear window. Down St. Giles and Magdalen Street, glimpses of town and gown as the wagon threaded its way through the grey, damp light, until at length they stopped and heard voices close by. The sound of gates being unbarred and swung open. Movement. And then, through the rear window, their vision was filled with an arch in a wall of grey stone, like a moor being filled as the gates were closed again, shutting off the last green glimpse of a grassy hill. Oxford Castle. And the first thing Sam and Tommy saw as they were unloaded from the police wagon were the high, square battlements of St. George's Tower brooding over them. Like a doom. And it was, too. Being, as they were, on remand and legally regarded as still innocent, for the next 3 months Speed and Jones were in a kind of penitentiary limbo. They were subject to the regimen of the jail like every other prisoner, sleeping in cells, sometimes with several other remand men, their lives ordered by the ringing of bells for eating and sleeping, and their every action under the strict supervision of warders. But they did not have to wear the grey prison uniform, marked with a government broad arrow, which, given the pitiful state of their own clothes, they began to regret as autumn drew on. Nor did they have to work at the mind-numbing hard labour the authorities deemed so essential to reforming the criminal mind, picking oakum or winding the capstan. Instead, they had time in the exercise yard and access to legal advice to prepare their defences for the pending trial, should funds permit it, which, for Sam and Tommy, they clearly did not. Nevertheless, the closed, confined world of Oxford Castle still bore down upon them like a press. For Samuel it was especially hard, and his adolescent spirit began to falter. It wasn't the rigorous discipline of daily life so much, not the discomfort of cold brick and stone, a hard bed and plain food. As a rural labourer, such things were a normal part of existence. Indeed, watery potatoes for midday dinner with the occasional scrap of meat, however poorly cooked, were a luxury only dreamed of but recently when he'd been starving on the road. In that respect, as Sammy gestured to the journalist, their plan had been a success. Tommy Jones was right. 3 meals a day, provided courtesy of Her Majesty Queen Victoria. No, It wasn't the physical privations that so reduced him, but the psychological ones. The high walls and medieval ramparts. The towers and barred windows, stone and steel and iron gates, beyond which he could see the sky and scudding clouds, but which prevented him from going out to meet them. The world had been open to him before. Now it was denied, and for Sam Speed, it was the mere fact he was no longer free that so began to crush him. Without work for his hands, and, being on remand, denied access to the prison library or schoolroom to occupy his mind, the hours between meals stretched into a boredom that only fed his anxiety. Their trial had been set down for the sittings at the end of November, and as the date approached, Samuel quite visibly began to lose heart. There hadn't been much of him when he was arrested, God knows, reduced after days of hunger and privation. But now, having put on weight after a regular prison diet for several months, he began to lose it again. His face acquired that sunken pallor so familiar in the visage of every prisoner, and his manner became more withdrawn, more nervous. He debated with himself over and over whether the certainty of 3 meals a day was worth the deprivation of his liberty, and deciding, again with a full belly, that it was not, Sam became increasingly depressed by the thought that so far as the law was concerned, he would lose that argument and be sentenced to spend eternity in this place. A week or so before the trial, Jones found him one afternoon standing very disconsolate by himself in a corner of the exercise yard. "Cheer up, Sammy," he remarked. "It ain't as bad as all that." "But it is, Tommy. Trial's on Monday, and I didn't do it. I didn't—" "Come on, Samuel. You know what happened." "Yes, but I can't abide the thought of being here forever. I can't.
The food's all right. It's what we wanted.
But it ain't worth it, and I never—"
"And it won't be for always. Chap told me that, 7 years or more, and they send you to Australia."
Botany Bay?
The horrors of that hellhole were imprinted on everybody's imagination. "Not any more, no. The other place, Swan River, Western Australia."
It was scarcely an improvement. The idea made Speed so distressed he was almost weeping, and Tom Jones, to his great surprise, found himself touched by it, as an older person may for a younger in travail. Whatever the truth of the rick burning, therefore, and whatever he may have said or done at the time, Jones put a comforting hand on his mate's shoulder.
"That's all right, Sammy," he said. "I can see you're in a bad way. If you want to change your story, to plead not guilty when you go before the judge, I'll back you up in it. I'll say I threatened you."
"And so you did."
"Yes, well, that may help things a bit for you, though I can't guarantee nothing, you understand."
"No, but I'll tell 'em. I'll let them know I'm not guilty."
"You do that, Sammy. You pass the word through the warders to the governor."
And satisfied that he'd given his young companion a week of hope at least, Jones let it go at that, though he remained quite perplexed as to why he'd done so. Mr. Justice Crompton was in a genial mood that Monday morning. He had travelled up with his associate, tipstaff and servants from the Circuit Court at Reading on Saturday, in the same train, as it happened, as the Crown Prince and Princess of Prussia, otherwise known as Victoria, the Princess Royal, eldest daughter of the dear Queen, who were paying a private visit to the university. They'd been welcomed at the station with all due expressions of loyalty and ceremony by Canon Stanley of Christ Church Cathedral, who was to show them around the principal attractions of Oxford. The majesty of the law also received every proper observance, with his lordship met on the platform by the High Sheriff, the Under-Sheriff, and a retinue of gentlemen from the faculties and profession who escorted Sir Charles Crompton with much respect to the County Hall and Court in New Road. The building had been erected only 20 years or so earlier, a curious confection in the local stone of Norman turrets and battlements, combined with late Georgian high-arched windows and spacious rooms. Some people described it as quite the most abominable pseudo-Gothic assizes court in all England. But in this they were perhaps being a little unfair. It was located right next door to the prison, The view from the jury room looked out to its walls, and the architect no doubt was trying to emulate the authentic early Gothic of the original Norman castle. In any event, convenience, not style, was the predominating factor. So handy was the courtroom, an underground tunnel with barred gates at either end had been constructed from the jail to the holding cells below the dock, thus saving the trouble of having to convey prisoners anywhere else and minimizing their chances of escape. Here, on a large, velvet-upholstered chair, his lordship took his seat on the bench. A carved canopy was suspended above his head, the royal coat of arms on the wall behind him. The legal fraternity packed the well of the court and the public galleries above, like a dress circle audience at the theatre. The commission opening these sittings of the Oxford Winter Assizes was read. Speeches of welcome were made, and after the civilities and a light luncheon, the learned judge was escorted to his lodgings in St. Giles, where, later that afternoon, he was waited upon by the mayor and city authorities, together with representatives of the university, who presented him with the customary gift of a pair of white kid gloves, fringed with gold as a symbol of fidelity and loyalty. The following morning, Mr. Justice Crompton attended Sunday service at Christ Church, where the Reverend Dr. Stanley preached an eloquent valedictory assize sermon to a full congregation on the subject of divine peace, truth, charity, and the ideal principles of a university. It had all been very satisfactory, and at the age of a trim and healthy 66, Sir Charles felt in particularly fine form in his judicial wig and robes when the court assembled at 10 o'clock on Monday for the sessions. The grand jury was called and empanelled, a distinguished selection of 21 upright country gentlemen, landowners, commercial and professional people, including 3 members of Parliament, one of whom was the foreman. Before bringing up the accused, however, Mr. Justice Crompton turned to the jury and delivered his opening charge on the matters that would be put before them. He'd been through the papers and thought they'd find them all pretty clear cases, except 1 or 2 which he brought to their attention. There was the matter of a respectable workhouse official charged with forging receipts, a hanging offence not so long ago, though being a man of liberal principles, Sir Charles was glad it was so no longer. A rather painful case of manslaughter, and several cases of rick-burning, where the jury would have to judge from the demeanour of the witnesses whether to believe them or not. It might sound strange to modern ears for a judge to run over the list to the jury before a trial, but that was the way of it. And indeed, to the intense misery of Sam Speed and the other prisoners waiting below, who could hear the words wafting down the staircase through the open door kept by a warder and the barred cell gate, his lordship reserved his strictest remarks for the rick-burners. I must say to you, gentlemen, that a vast proportion of the crime here in Oxford and Berkshire is rick-burning, as I find it's become so prevalent all over the country. There were 6 cases in Reading last week, and 11 are to be brought before you today. Almost universally they appear to be strangers to the county who, in a state of destitution, resort to the crime apparently for the purpose of being put in prison and sentenced to penal servitude. Indeed, a long time in prison seems to be just what they want. A little pause for this moment of judicial levity, before the words became more severe. And in my opinion, a short term of imprisonment would do nothing to mark the enormity of their crime. Enormity? The word struck Samuel, listening in the cell below, with all the force of a gallows drop. It was bad to burn Hind's Stack, I know, but enormous? We didn't hurt anybody. Nobody lost a life, unlike the sad case of manslaughter the judge just mentioned. But then, of course, the law always regarded crimes against property as far more serious than crimes against the person. Well, I hope these people will not find penal servitude as pleasant as they seem to expect. His lordship, in scarlet and ermine, continued his remarks to the grand jury above. It did occur to me in Reading, gentlemen, that if we, as a community, are to resort to corporal punishment at all, it might be for such cases as rick-burning, where it could have some effect in preventing men from committing the crime. And preventing them from starving? but his lordship didn't pause to consider that question. "However, the law does not permit the administration of corporal punishment except to persons under the age of 16. How wise of Tommy Jones to warn me. At Reading, I was able to order a boy to be flogged, and in a case to come before you today, there is a child of 9 here charged with arson." Samuel looked down at the ragged imp, John Smith, beside him in the cell, his hands in irons, as were they all, and crying to himself. He'd had not one visitor in the prison since July, except the magistrate who'd committed him there. And Sam felt the same compassion for little Johnny as an elder to a younger that Jones had shown Sam when he offered to testify for him. And Speed would have put his arms around the boy for comfort, too, had he been able. "Evidently it would be of no use to keep such a child of 9 in prison," the judge's words came floating down.
"The birch awaits you, laddie."
"And I believe it is a subject for consideration whether corporal punishment might not be extended to others, older than 16, who commit this particular crime." Certainly something for the members of Parliament sitting among them in the jury box to think about.
"Sentence first, verdict afterwards."
Old Sam Speed, in his bed, could hear these words from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland echoing 3/4 of a century later. Sentence first, verdict afterwards in the court of the Queen of Hearts. And it occurred to Samuel, with a laugh, that they had been written by an Oxford don at much the same time of his own trial, where their author would have had every opportunity to see Mr. Justice Crompton in action. The grand jury having been nicely primed, the hearings began. They did not take long. As each prisoner's name was called by the clerk, repeated by the usher and called by a guard down the stairs to those below, a warder unlocked the cell gate. The accused stepped forward and had the handcuffs removed. It was a concession to the presumption of innocence that every person had before they ascended the narrow wooden stairs. A guard fore and aft to the waist-high barrier of the dock, but only a concession. Everything else that architecture, interior design, costume and ritual could do to overawe the prisoner had been done. The presiding judge on his high dais in front, the suited jurymen in their box to his right, the clerks and lawyers wigged and gowned at the bar table, whom very few could afford in their defence, all united to focus attention and prejudice on the sad and solitary figures of those who'd been charged. Intimidating it might have been, but the leniency shown by the court in the first few cases gave heart to Sam Speed and his fellows listening below. The man charged with manslaughter pleaded guilty, but as he was defending his mother and had not meant to kill her attacker, Mr. Justice Crompton sentenced him to 3 days' imprisonment from the start of the assizes and had him released immediately.
3 cheers downstairs.
3 men who robbed a jewellery shop were given only 12 months, because there'd not been much damage to property or terror caused to the inhabitants. Even 9-year-old John Smith, whose head could barely be seen above the rail, had his whipping deferred and was sent back to prison to wait for another few months until a missing witness turned up. But then came the arson cases. The first 3 were each sentenced to 6 years, accompanied by a lecture from the judge in similar terms to the one he'd given to the jury. "You say you did it to get victuals, but it's a shocking thing to destroy property in this way. You might suppose you'll have a pleasant time as prisoners getting into public works, but you'll find a good deal you don't like before you get there. And I hope that in a little while it will be made much more disagreeable than people in your position have any idea of." A further hint to the members of Parliament on the jury concerning the benefits of the lash as a remedy against those who took hunger to extremes. Still, it was only 6 years, which meant their sentences would be served at home. Yet the next was for 7, undoubtedly transportation, for Mr. Justice Crompton was getting into his stride. "Crimes of this kind must be severely punished. and it was with sinking spirits and sombre steps that Sam and Tom Jones took their turn to ascend the steps, as if to a scaffold where fate was waiting. How bright the light seemed after the gaslit gloom below. Late autumn sun streaming through the windows, faces turned expectantly towards them, the hum of voices that rose as each new performer took their place, as it were, in the theatre of the court. The two men seemed momentarily disoriented, as perhaps they were meant to be, standing with hands on the wooden bar of the dock, a warder on either side. A little confused as the voice of the clerk came to them through the shining light, and silence fell. "Thomas Jones and Samuel Speed, you are each of you charged with arson in that you set fire to a barley rick, the property of Joseph Hines, at Bladen, Woodstock, on the 8th of August last. How do you plead?" A pause to digest what was being required of them, a nudge from the warder. Then, "Guilty," from Thomas Jones. "Not guilty, your worships," from Samuel Speed, followed by a voice from the judge. "Very well. The pleas have been recorded. I will reserve sentence against Jones until the case against Speed has been heard with his defence. Mr. Sawyer, I believe you are prosecuting?" "I am, my lord." A wig and black gown rose at the bar table and briefly outlined the facts of the case to the jury. Charles Ferraby was called to the witness stand and, without going into the detail of what had happened beforehand, told the court he'd seen the two accused outside the Union Workhouse and going up to Mr. Hines's field a few minutes before he saw the fire out of the window. "Does the defence have any questions?" But Samuel had no counsel except his own, and he couldn't think at that moment of anything to ask. "I should have said about Ferraby turning us away that night, but I didn't. Should have said he was cruel, but I forgot." Inspector Coates then took the stand and described how he'd seen the prisoners by the police station on the night of the fire, the admissions they'd made, and of finding the box of matches where Jones said he'd thrown it in the lane. "Any questions?" But again, there were none. "It were too dangerous to go there." "That is the case for the prosecution, my lord." "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. Speed, what do you wish to say in your defence?" "It was my moment on the stage in the spotlight, but I managed to fluff my lines." Samuel's hand trembled on the bar, and his voice rose in pitch as nerves took hold. "I only want to say, sir, that I didn't light the fire," he began. "I went up to the field with Tommy Jones, as I told the inspector, but I stayed by the gate when he went in by himself." There was a long pause as a question, yet unasked or answered, hung in the judicial atmosphere. What did you think he was going to do? "I thought he was going for a pee." Shock, gasps, titters. "I just blurted it out, and it were funny, but a blunder all the same." "The prisoner will mind his language," Sir Charles spoke sternly from the bench. "There are ladies present in court. You say you thought he was going into the field for a different purpose?" "Yes, sir, a different purpose." Another silence, in which Samuel knew he was supposed to say something further in his defence. But nothing came to him in this extremis except the truth. "I went up to the field with Tommy, and he threatened me to say that I lit the fire with him, and I promised I wouldn't peach on him." "Is there anything else you wish to add?" Mr. Justice Crompton asked. "No, your lordship." "I'm advised that the co-accused, Jones, wishes to speak on Speed's behalf. Do you wish to make a statement from the dock, or go into the witness box where you may be cross-examined?" Tommy Jones hunched his shoulders. "I'll stay here, thank you. I just want to say, sirs, that it was my doing, all mine. I lit the fire by myself, and I threatened Sammy to say that he had done it as well, just as he told you." The court waited to see if Jones had anything more to add, which seemed to be expected. "We were given a halfpenny on the road, see, like the inspector said, and instead of buying something to eat with it, I thought we should buy matches." Another blunder. "But it was my idea, and Sammy didn't have nothing to do with it, and that's all I want to say." "Very well. Mr. Sawyer, do you wish to add anything for the prosecution?" "Very little, my lord. The case seems clear enough." Mr. Sawyer at the bar table turned to face the jury and spoke to them in conversational, almost familiar terms. "Gentlemen, we've heard the essential facts from the porter at the workhouse and Inspector Coates, and their evidence has not been contested. The prisoner has admitted to being at the field gate, but says he had nothing to do with lighting the barley stack, and only confessed to the police because Jones threatened him. In his evidence, Jones acknowledged that he'd purchased the matches with a halfpenny the pair had been given on the road. Because the prisoners gave their statements from the dock, the court has had no opportunity to question them. But I think in your deliberations you are entitled to ask yourselves this. Did Speed and Jones not discuss among themselves what they should do with the halfpenny? Should they buy bread, or should they get matches? Did the subject never come up between them? And if you believe that it probably did, and as we know from Inspector Coates, Speed was present in the shop when the matches were purchased, I suggest the only sensible conclusion is that Speed knew perfectly well for what purpose they were intended. He was just as culpable as Jones in lighting the fire. He admitted as much to the police at the time, and only now, late in the day, is he changing his story. But I never did. It was true all along. Mr. Sawyer sat down, and the judge briefly gave his summing up. The basic facts were not in dispute, as the prosecution had stated, and the only matter for them to consider was whether the prisoner Speed had lit the fire with Jones or knew he was going to do so. It is for you, gentlemen, to either accept or reject his denials. You may retire to consider your verdict. The jury did so for appearance's sake, but not for very long. 10 minutes and they were back. Have you agreed upon a verdict? Asked the clerk. We have, from the parliamentary foreman. Do you find the prisoner Speed guilty or not guilty of arson? Samuel shaking like a moth before the candle. Guilty. Thank you, gentlemen. Followed by another short lecture from Sir Charles on the heinous crime of rick burning, the prevalence of hunger as a motive, the merits of the whip to suppress it, and the fond hope expressed that Speed and Jones would find incarceration a lot less pleasant than they seemed to think it would be. 7 years penal servitude, each. The first 2 in England, after that, transportation. And as the light began to dim around them, the ushers rose, the curtain fell, and the audience disappeared from view. Take the prisoners down. 6. Oxford Castle. The judge was right about that. Samuel stretched his limbs under the bedclothes and turned towards the journalist, Cribben. The prisons in England were not very pleasant places at all. In what way, Sam? What were they like? Oh, they were hard, tough. I suppose they have to be. Yes, you'd expect that. Not holiday camps. No, definitely not that. As the old man felt himself starting to fall again, like Alice, through a tunnel dark and strewn with griefs into his past. No holiday, though whatever stories you hear, as he made one last effort to stop the descent, the screws, the officers, were pretty good to me. There are no scars on my back, and there was plenty of food. Liar. Once you went to prison, there was enough to keep you alive and able to work, such draining, pointless work for the most part. But the food was coarse, tasteless, and hard to swallow, as it was meant to be. Suet pudding with greasy lumps, meat full of fat, and stale bread. The whole system was based on punishment and degradation. on breaking the spirit, the old pattern of moral turpitude that had led you there in the first place, while attempting transformation to a law-abiding life through prayer, hard labour, and a basic education. For some convicts it had this desired effect. Sammy Speed liked to think he was one of those who profited. Not in any material sense, for look at me, he thought, propped up here in the old men's home with nothing, though some others did nicely for themselves, but within himself, spiritually, if you want to put it that way. God found me in the end, and I've never reoffended, not even for being drunk and disorderly. Never been drunk, except once, from the day I entered Oxford Castle. But for so many others, Samuel knew, the penal system merely broke them, and their lives were never put together again. Cribben looked at the old chap leaning back against the pillows, his eyes closed and lips moving as if he were talking to himself, though no words could be heard. "Is he all right?" the reporter spoke to Bob the tuppenny orderly, sitting on the other bed. "Has he gone to sleep?" "I don't think so." Bob stood up and lightly touched the old bloke on the shoulder, just as he had done at getting up time this morning. "Sammy." Samuel opened his one good eye, looked at Bob a moment, then shut it again. "Nah, he's all right, just collecting himself. He's old, and gets a bit forgetful." "Forgetful? What nonsense you talk, Bob." Who could forget, even if that were possible? "I'm there again, Bob. And you know as well as anyone that we can live a whole lifespan in a few remembered seconds." And Samuel was there in memory, returning down the long, dim tunnel. No Wonderland metaphor, this, from the cells below the Assizes Court and into his new existence as a convict condemned to 7 years penal servitude. Sir Charles Crompton had conducted his business briskly, and the sittings were all over by 3 o'clock. The gentlemen of the grand jury had been thanked for their labours and dismissed. The judge retired to a hearty luncheon, and the prisoners below were put back in irons and returned to Oxford Castle, whence they came. "Tommy, what do you think will happen now?" Samuel spoke softly to his mate in front of him, as they clinked in single file through the enclosed brick twilight, warders front and back and on both sides. The words of his lordship, addressed to 3 other arsonists among their number, were still resonating in his ears. "You might suppose you'll have a pleasant time as prisoners getting into public works, but you'll find a good deal you don't like before you get there." Retribution was in the air, and Sammy didn't know what it meant. "What will they do to us?" Yet his words were overheard by a guard, who spoke to him swiftly. "Silence! There will be no talking. You said all you had to say to the judge, and there'll be no more words from you for a long time." In such manner was Samuel Speed introduced to the silent system of the English penal regime, and within the hour to the separate system too. Arrived back in the prison yard, the convicted prisoners no longer enjoyed the relative freedoms within the jail they had on remand. They were instead taken to the penitentiary reception area, their crimes, sentences, and personal details recorded in the ledger. Samuel Speed, number 139, 5 feet 2 inches, brown hair, fair complexion, grey eyes, 18, can read and write, R and W, round-shouldered, scar under left ear, cataract on left eye, labourer, 7 years penal servitude, PS, all entered in the appropriate ruled columns. From then on within the prison he would always be known as 139, the identity of a name removed from him, until such time as he was taken elsewhere and assigned another number. Within a few years the Oxford prisoners' photographs would also be taken, but not yet in 1863. After the clerks, they were stripped of their clothes, hair cropped close to the skull, and made to wash in a deep bath, smelling strongly of carbolic acid, or phenol as it's usually known, used as a disinfectant and a means to disguise foul odours. The object was twofold. In a practical sense, to remove the dirt and vermin accumulated on the bodies of poor men, and women in their section, to whom soap and water were comparative strangers, and in a more abstract sense, to cleanse them of the impurities of their former ways, and prepare these prisoners for the more virtuous life into which it was intended the system would eventually guide them. For this, not only were clean bodies necessary, but clean clothes as well. And from the bathhouse, Samuel and his fellows were issued with their prison uniforms. A coarse white jacket branded with a convict's broad arrow, grey trousers tied at the back, for no belts were allowed in case prisoners hanged themselves with them in despair, socks, boots, and a square pillbox hat. All the same, no names, just numbers, all traces of individuality removed, and their humanity pared back to the bare essentials on which, it was hoped, the reformers could get to work. In all this introductory business, it was unavoidable that some speech had to be permitted, if only to give orders and answer questions. Allowance, too, for the prison governor who addressed his new charges briefly in severe terms, advising them to follow every order promptly and cheerfully, lest their lot become even more burdensome. He was followed by the chaplain who told them that, through daily prayer and diligent reading of their Bibles, it was expected they would be led to repent the errors of their ways and avoid sin in future. His tone was softer, though a thread of steel ran through it, and there was no doubt among his listeners that this also was intended as an instruction. No conversation or questions were permitted among the men themselves, and once they were led to their separate cells in the new and modern wing, constructed on principles of the model prison, 3 tiers of brick and stone and iron-studded doors rising either side of the central walkway under a high, vaulted roof, absolute silence was enforced, as it was in almost every aspect of their future lives. For the reformers knew perfectly well that a bath and fresh clothes were only symbolic first steps in the cleansing process. If these unfortunates were to really change their lives, they needed time to reflect in silence on the nature of their crimes, to become truly penitent before they could hope to find salvation, and to do so not only silently but also separately, removed from the company and influence of their erstwhile associates. Not for nothing were these new prisons called penitentiaries. Hence, for the first 9 months of their sentences, convicts were required to be kept in separate confinement, alone in their cells for some 22 out of every 24 hours, with only Holy Scripture to ease their minds, hard labour for occupation, and just their conscience, the warder on his rounds to bring work and meals, or the occasional visit of the prison chaplain and schoolmaster for companionship. In some prisons, inmates even had to wear veiled caps over their faces in the exercise yard so they should not recognise each other, sit in separate stalls in chapel, and universally to refrain from speech or any attempt at communication by sign or gesture, even in the common workroom after their 9 months in the separate cells. It wasn't solitary confinement in the strict sense. That was reserved for the refractory prisoners, the bad ones, who sometimes spent days or even weeks in the dark cells. But separation was near enough, and still drove some of them mad. Indeed, by depriving men and women of their vital humanity and social instincts, the system more often than not destroyed the very spirit it hoped to redeem. Leaden obedience rooted in fear, not divine love, was the most it usually achieved, which perhaps is what officialdom wanted all along. Such, at least, was Sam Speed's experience, number 139 above his cell door, as he endured his separate confinement in Oxford Castle. Fear, certainly, and also hatred diluted with a certain capacity to manipulate the system for his own purposes. For the first few days, Samuel was merely in a state of shock, disbelief that this had happened to him. He'd found it hard enough to bear before, in the remand section, where prison walls and gates stood between him and all he'd known of fields and woodland and the streets of a town. But at least he'd had the liberty of the exercise yard. Now, he was enclosed by the whitewashed walls of a brick chamber 10 feet by 6, a high barred window through which only fragments of sky and a few night stars could be glimpsed, and a door bolted and locked, with an eye slot through which a warder could see his every movement. An iron bed, a table on which sat a Bible as yet unopened, a stool, wash basin and toilet bucket, and this, for 139, was to be his shelter for the next how many months? Shelter? It was a cage, which Samuel paced up and down like a wild animal in captivity, hour after hour on that first day, until he knew every crack and stain on the walls and floorboards, by turns bemoaning his fate and cursing those who'd put him here.
Tommy! Tommy, you bastard! You never told me it would be like this! Why didn't you say? Damn you and bugger you, everyone! Mr. High and bloody mighty Judge, God rot you all!
His lordship merely laughed. I said that you'll find a good deal you don't like. But all this, of course, in the silent echoes of thought. Once or twice Samuel did cry out in his anguish, Tommy! Where are you? The first time was followed by a banging at the door and orders to be quiet. The second by a warder unlocking the door and entering the cell. You know the rules, number 139. No speaking. If you breach them again, you will be taken outside and whipped. Understand? For along with cleanliness and time for private meditation, the reformers also knew that mortification of the flesh was another sure path to virtue. Birch sticks, soaked in water for maximum flexibility, and beaten on the bare buttocks for maximum effect. Flogging with the cat and nine tails for the truly recalcitrant. The warder didn't wait for an answer. To reply would have been against the rules anyway, so Samuel was left to rage and burn like the dumb. Grief and anger and helplessness simmered inside him like a pot on the stove, until they'd boil over and the tears spill down, Sammy striking his body with his own fists for lack of anyone else to hurt. I hate the lot of you! Everything! But only to his inner demons. His misery was compounded the next morning when he was introduced to the servitude of picking oakum. It was still early dawn as Sam's restlessness was disturbed by the sound of a bell ringing and doors opening further down the catwalk. This was the time fixed by the regulations hanging on every cell wall for prisoners to rise, wash, dress themselves, fold the blankets neatly, and prepare for the labours of the day. Hastily he got up and was still putting on his boots when the cell door opened, and a warder entered carrying a lantern and a wooden tray. Samuel supposed it was his breakfast, but instead it contained only several short lengths of ship's rope, tarred and weather-stained. This is for you, 139, the warder said, placing the tray on the small cell table. Oakum! You are to tease out each separate strand from the rope and place it in a neat pile back on the tray. I will expect it completed by this evening. What's it for? Sam couldn't help asking. To keep you busy, and to caulk the decking planks of ships and such like. Now be silent and get to work. Your meals will be brought later. Samuel pulled the small stool to the table and, sitting down, began the first of many endless days' labour picking apart hempen rope. It was stiff and tough, and difficult to even find a loose strand with which to start. His fingers hurt, and his nails cracked and split as little by little he prized out the first threads and placed them beside him on the table. Hard to see, too, in the dingy light. The sky through the window square was pale and overcast, and the gas lamp gave little illumination, for it was placed high on the wall, above a man's reach even standing on the bed, to prevent any attempt at suicide by gas poisoning. Oakum picking therefore required all Samuel's attention, bent over the table, pulling the wretched stuff apart, strand by strand, until his fingers were blistered and his back ached as if he'd been flogged already. Nor did he dare stop for any length of time to ease his body, for the warders were constantly on their rounds, looking through the peephole to make sure he was not slacking, and Sam knew what awaited if he was caught. The most he was allowed was an occasional stretch and a walk to the toilet bucket to relieve himself. "You've not done very much today, 139, said the warder when he brought the evening meal. I expected this to be finished. Sorry, downcast and softer voice. Still, this is your first day at it. You'll get better. Practice makes perfect, eh? And with a sneer he left and locked the cell. However tiring the work, Sam could find little release in sleep. For the first month of their confinement, prisoners were not issued with mattresses. Only 3 wooden boards were provided to lay on the frame of the iron bed, and these permitted no repose. They were intended, perhaps, as another summary aid on the path to contrition. But for Samuel, all they added was one more torture to his life. Lying on the hard slats at night, with only a rough blanket between him and the cold of Christmas, unable to ease his aching bones or soothe his mind, he'd think on the soft, lice-ridden straw palliaces of a workhouse, the welcoming hay of a barn, or the downy perfumes of a bed under the hedgerows, with the field creatures for company and a lark to wake him. At length, he'd fall into a fitful kind of unconsciousness for an hour or two, until the pain in his joints and muscles and mind would rouse him again. "Tommy, why did you get me into this?" And the cycle of blame and woe and fury would begin all over again. "Oh, God, please help me." Samuel did see Tommy Jones from a distance each morning, when they were taken out of their cells to attend prayers in the chapel, and sometimes again during the hour in the exercise yard. As far as possible, the warders tried to keep known associates in separate groups, but it was inevitable the pair would occasionally find themselves in the same line of prisoners walking mechanically around the yard under the watchful eyes of the warders, sometimes even making eye contact, Sammy sending out sparks of hostility. "This is your fault." But nothing more. All was silence except for the tramp of sullen feet on the cobbles, grateful to be out of their cells and in the company of fellow beings, if only for an hour, but not one of them who wasn't praying fervently to the God of prisoners, whoever that might be, that these same boots might be taking them anywhere out of this place. "Blast you all to hell!" Yet anger cannot be maintained forever. Even the most active volcano will eventually subside into smaller, less frequent eruptions, with only the occasional release of steam to let you know the molten core is still there and liable to spew forth at any time. So with Samuel's Speed and every human spirit. As the new year turned and he was given a coarse stuffed mattress to sleep upon, Sam's more violent emotions began to moderate a little. Not into acceptance or resignation, certainly, but to a broad realization that the God he kept calling upon was not going to help him, nor was anybody else, that he was here in this prison for the duration, or at least until such time as the authorities decided to take him to another one. Silent resentment, rather than fury, now took charge of his mind, though the Vesuvius of his anger was not extinct, but merely lying dormant.
This is the end of CD 2. The book continues on CD 3. CD 3.
The warders on their rounds, and especially the prison chaplain, the Reverend Mr. Gregory Hartnett, began to notice the change in him. For the first few weeks, Sam wanted nothing to do with the chaplain. He'd look up from his oakum picking at the table as the man in black entered his cell, and stare as Hartnett proclaimed, "I have come to pray with you, 139, for God's forgiveness." "I'd done nothing," out loud, until the prisoner remembered and spat out the rest as a whisper. "To forgive." "Oh, but you have." "I told the judge." "Who decided otherwise. Turn now to him who can forgive everything." "Go away." And as prisoner 139 turned back to his work, the chaplain fell to his knees and began to pray to God who can see into the hearts of all men. "Come, 139. "No, it's an order." And knowing that prison orders had the authority of the birch and cat to support them, Samuel knelt beside the padre with reluctance, but throughout continued to look around the cell and twist his hands together in agitation. "I see that the Bible on your table has not moved from where it was first put," Mr. Hartnett remarked as he left the cell after a second or third visit. "I advise you to open it. Isaiah, chapter 61, verse 1. The Bible stayed where it was. It wasn't until a subsequent call when Hartnett indicated that reading the Bible might also be considered a requirement, with all its ramifications, that Sammy took up the book. and opening the page at the desired passage, stumbled over the words, "He has sent me to bind up the broken-hearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound." Rubbish! Nobody was going to open the prison to him, bound or unbound, and he closed it up again. Still, the chaplain was gratified to see on his next visit that prisoner 139 had heeded his advice, and urged him to profit by continuing to study the Holy Scriptures during that hour of solitary recreation before the gas lamp was turned off at night. "You will find much in it to comfort you. Consider the psalm, 'The Lord gives freedom to the prisoners.'" Samuel didn't believe a word of it, but knew enough not to say so. It was instead with a note of humility in his voice that he replied, "Trouble is, sir, that I find some of the words too difficult." He spoke softly so as not to disturb the warders outside, even though the chaplain's visit always carried a small dispensation from silence. "Eh?" Mr. Hartnett seemed surprised. "I thought you could read and write. It says so." "Yes, but not very well. Do you have any books with stories and pictures in them?" "The Bible is filled with hundreds of stories, the parables of our Lord." "But no pictures, no interesting things about the real world." "Well, no," the clergyman brought himself up short. "Of course, we do have a library in the prison with all kinds of useful and uplifting books. Some of them even have illustrations." "Can't I read those?" "I am afraid, 139, they are only available, one at a time, to those prisoners who can demonstrate to me that they are able to read the New Testament." "Oh." A small nucleus of thought stirred at the back of Sam's mind. "Of course, I can read a fair bit of it. Let me hear you." Hartnett picked up the Bible from Sam's table and leafed through the pages to a favourite test passage, St. Mark, chapter 15, verses 5 to 6, where Jesus is brought before Pilate. "Now at that feast he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that made insurrection with him who had committed murder in the insurrection." "Read it for me, out loud." Samuel began to do so, slowly, though cantering confidently enough along the course to begin with, for the first words were easy. But he tripped at re-li-sed, which came out as 3 distinct syllables, as did per-is-un-ner with 4. Whomsoever and Barabbas were hurdles almost too high to jump, and at insurrection twice and murder in the final straight he made several attempts, balked, and at last fell down completely. "Well, at least you didn't overstate your ability, 139. "So what can I do, sir?" Samuel smiled, just a little too slyly. "I'm ever so anxious to read the good book." Gregory Hartnett was not a fool, and he recognized an opportunity for a little evangelizing when he saw it. "Clearly you must improve your reading of the Scriptures before you attempt any other, good books from the prison library. It's too soon into your sentence to attend classes with other prisoners in the schoolroom, but I could send Mr. Martin to visit you." "Mr. who?" "The schoolmaster. Surely he's been to see you already." "Yes, but I sent him away. Shouldn't have done that." Remorsefully. "No, indeed. But he is permitted to instruct some men confined to their separate cells on my recommendation. Shall I ask him to call on you again?" "Oh, please, sir, yes," brightening at the prospect of some relief from the drudgery of the oakum tray and his inner turmoil. "Very well. Mind you, I will keep a close eye on your progress, and hope not to be disappointed in you, 139. "No, sir, never that, I promise." And Samuel Speed bared an artful smile. Thus, a day or so later, Mr. Martin came to the cell with a couple of reading books to gauge the extent of Sam's capacity, help him improve his skills, and thereby, in time, to navigate successfully the tricky shoals of the New Testament before entering the happier waters of the prison library. Amos Martin was an older man, grey of countenance and manner, whose intellect had not enabled him to rise higher in the competitive environment of a university town than the Oxford Castle schoolroom. But within these confines, he was a diligent, methodical teacher, who took Samuel through his lessons for an hour or so several days each week. Carefully going over the syllables of each new word, disobedience, strawberry, attentive, obliging, explaining the meaning of words Sam had never heard before, such as insurrection, which, when he grasped it, pretty much reflected the suppressed desires of his own heart. Reading beside his pupil as Sam began each new lesson from the primer. When Martha Dunn lost her parents, she was put under the care of an old woman named Molly Flint. Morally uplifting little stories on the whole, but they frequently had pictures and sometimes touched on things with which Speed was familiar. The difference between a horse's hoof and a cow's cloven foot, sheep with wool and goats with hair, the first visit to the country by a boy, also called Sam, who sat on a rock and praised God for making so many beautiful things. A rather extreme reaction, Samuel thought, but on reflection, alone in his 10-by-6 brick cell, he understood it perfectly. Samuel repeated passages with Mr. Martin until he could read them fluently, recognizing the difficult words and passing them more confidently, even the ones in the chaplain's verse from St. Mark that threw him, Barabbas and murder. It was not permitted for the teacher to leave his lesson book in the cell, but he did suggest passages from the Testament for Samuel to study in that free hour before lights out, and prepare himself a little better for the chaplain's next test of his progress. It was the first time since he was a workhouse child that Sam had received any regular schooling. He had a quick head, and with a definite goal in mind, he looked forward to Mr. Martin's hour of instruction. Day after day, as one week followed another, and winter outside in the exercise yard began to thaw into spring, Samuel felt himself beginning to improve, tracing the letters with his finger on the damp wall beside his bed at nights. Confident. Wishfully. And muttering under his breath as he tore at the rope end during the day, Verily, verily, I say unto you, your sorrow shall be turned to joy. If only I can string along Mr. Hartnett a bit more. The chaplain and warders observed the change in his manner and were pleased. It was quite normal for the behaviour of a convict to progress in this way, under the influence of prison rules and scripture. For the clergyman, it was an indication that 139 had meditated upon his sin, was beginning to purge it, and would soon seek God's forgiveness. For the prison officers, it was merely a sign that his spirit was beginning to break at last and yield to the strictures of discipline. In some sense, they were both correct. Samuel was certainly full of repentance, or at any rate, regret that he'd been involved with the rick burning or had ever met Tommy Jones. Sorrow that they'd led to this miserable confinement and the likelihood of transportation. Resignation, too, that he'd never escaped from the castle. He'd looked often enough at the high walls and locked gates during his brief glimpses of the outside world from the exercise yard, as had they all, and knew there was no way out except in a prison van or a coffin. The alternative was to try and use the system to his own advantage, and Sammy Speed was uncomplicated enough to know how it might be done. Finding the route to escape, at least in imagination, through the books in the prison library was an end, and the regular visits of the schoolmaster to his cell provided not only the key to that room, but a short release from the toils of the oakum table. So much so, indeed, that even as his reading improved, Samuel always took care to falter over his New Testament when he came to read for the clergyman, lest he be thought ready for a library book too quickly and the lessons finish. So, when the officials looked at prisoner 139 bent over his table, they saw contrition and acceptance. What they did not understand was that, while Speed's loathing continued to stew beneath the surface, it was kept in check by his need to play them at their own game. He became the penitent from necessity, not desire. Sam smiled thinly, and they saw remorse when he really meant contempt. Many years afterwards, in Western Australia, Sam Speed was to read a book about the penal system called Moondine, written by John Boyle O'Reilly. He'd been a convict, like Sam, who was working in the Vassar at the same time as him in the later 60s, one of the rebel Fenians and one who did escape to America. And in his book, O'Reilly remarked that for a prisoner, the year is not made up of 365 individual days. It is the same day endured 365 times.
He spoke from the heart there.
But for Samuel Speed, it was not entirely so. Toiling at the oakum table in his Oxford cell, he certainly sometimes wished the hemp rope he was teasing apart might be used instead to hang him. But just as the dead weight of depression was about to settle on his soul, Sam would think that his teacher might visit him today with a story in his reader about one of those strange pouched creatures in that distant country to which Sam was to be deported. Ma-su-pi-all. Perhaps it would have a picture. Or maybe Mr. Hartnett would come to pray over him and recite a verse from the Testaments. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and broke their chains in two. Rot, of course. What about my chains? But at least he knew how to spell it. Old Samuel chuckled softly to himself in his bed and murmured,
"No holiday camp. No, not that."
And he looked at the journalist, Cribben, with reproachful eyes, as if he could possibly understand what it was like. 7. The Crank. Sorrow turned to a thin smile on the old man's lips. Something funny had occurred to him.
"The boss knows about prisons," Samuel said.
Albert Rust? Josh Cribben, the reporter, sounded incredulous. Was this a news story?
"I don't mean from the inside. No, but he understands. It's why he's never run this place like one. No prisons here."
Which wasn't quite true either, for Sammy well knew that the old men's home always had a padded cell, and the depot before it, where they put the fractious and quarrelsome drunks to sleep off the booze and come to their senses. It was on the other side of this block. The lockup may not have been intended as a punishment. Rather, it was for the men's own protection, the boss said, but that's what it amounted to. And Bert Rust knew this from experience. Sam's grin broadened as he remembered it. There was one old sot, Freddie Gammon, who was a regular guest in the padded cell, always coming back with a skinful and argumentative. He'd spent one memorable night in the cell, and the boss, coming on his rounds early next morning to let him out, was horrified to see Freddie lying stiff and motionless on the stretcher. Fearing that he might be dead, Rust went into the cell, hurried across to the corpse and touched it. Instantly, Freddie sprang back to life, grabbed the boss, threw him to the ground, and ran out of the cell, locking it behind him.
"He was stronger than he looked, that Freddie. Anger can do that for you."
When the boss had not returned for breakfast, or even to start the day's work, search parties were organized. But there was no sign of him for over 3 hours until the deputy superintendent, Charlie Brick, passing the padded cell, thought he'd looked through the eye slot. And there was the boss, sitting on the edge of the stretcher with steam coming out of his ears. Released from incarceration, Bert Rust went outside to find Freddie Gammon sitting on a bench and enjoying the morning sun. "What the devil did you do that for?" the boss demanded to know, the words tumbling out in a passion. "Why did you lock me in that cell, eh?" Freddie was unmoved.
"Did you like it in there, boss?"
"No, I did not. I didn't think much of it at all."
"Well, neither did I,"
Freddie responded laconically, and the retort so threw Bert Rust off balance that he began to laugh. Though in future he always made sure he had somebody else with him when he released an inmate from the padded cell. Samuel laughed with him and wondered if he should tell that to the newspaper reporter. "Nothing too grim," Mr. Rust had briefed him for the interview yesterday. "Just some amusing little anecdotes that people like to read." Here was one, but shrewdly glancing at the reporter with pencil poised over his notebook, Sammy wondered if the boss would like to be the butt of a joke told against himself, decided that he wouldn't, and let it pass.
"But still, if 3 hours in solitary could do that to Mr. Rust, Imagine what months of separate confinement did to me.
How long were you in prison, Sam, before you left for Fremantle?
2 years and a half, nearly, Mr. Cribben. And I never got to enjoy any of it.
Anything grim was smothered under a laugh, though it didn't disappear. Enjoyment, of course, had nothing to do with it. Survival in the confined world of a prison is everything, and not least the small stratagems every inmate learns to help them bear it. Samuel had his reading lessons to break the painful monotony of oakum picking, and even there he found a ruse to help prevent the worst of the damage to his calloused fingers. One morning, walking briskly in a double circle around the exercise yard, he noticed Tommy Jones coming towards him with his fingers moving in a strange way, as if he were doing some sort of aerial knitting. Their eyes met, and while Sam's blazed with his usual anger, he sensed the hint of a smile in Tommy's countenance, and a quick downward glance as if directing attention to his fingers. Initially, Samuel supposed it was just nervous agitation, perhaps even the first signs of prison madness. But the next time they passed, there seemed something more intentional, deliberate about it. And the third time, he noticed a small twig, sharpened at one end, held almost imperceptibly between Tommy's thumb and forefinger. What was he doing? Until, in a moment, it occurred that he was pretending to pick oakum, using the twig as a kind of spindle to loosen the strands instead of his broken fingernails. Clever! Something Tommy must have learnt in the army. As they passed on the next circuit, Samuel touched the side of his nose briefly to let Jones know that his message had been understood, with thanks. His eyes softened a little in return, and so did some of Sam's hatred. Another beginning. While it took a few more days for Samuel to find and surreptitiously pick up a twig of his own in the exercise yard, hone it to a point on the rough brick of his cell wall and hide it, when not in use, behind the toilet bucket, thereafter his hands didn't hurt half so much. His output increased, and the warder collected his nightly offerings of hemp a happy man. So, too, was prisoner 139, another small victory. As for the reading, it was improving all the time, and also becoming increasingly hard to disguise that fact from Mr. Hartnett. In part, it was Sam's daily practice and mental repetition of words and spellings as he picked at the rope with his little twig. He even began leafing through the New Testament during the hour before bed to find words that were quite unfamiliar to him. Gentiles. Tiberius. He'd learn them and ask Amos Martin what they meant at his next lesson, picking up a little history at the same time. This, in turn, stimulated his interest, especially when they began reading about exotic animals, lions and elephants from Africa, tigers from India, which Sam may have heard of but never seen, though he gleaned something from the pictures in his book. Journeys through story to places in Europe, much closer to home. Copenhagen, Switzerland, Versailles, which to his amazement was actually pronounced Versailles. Speed had barely any sense of geography, so Mr. Martin brought a small pocket map to these lessons. It not only opened an idea of the world to Sam, including distant Australia and the Swan River colony, but served further to prompt his curiosity and desire to read even more. Hence the difficulty in hiding his abilities from the chaplain during his formal, stumbled readings of the New Testament. Gregory Hartnett was, in any case, well aware of what was going on. He was briefed by the schoolmaster on 139's progress, confirmed by quietly listening to the lessons sometimes from outside the cell door. And while the prisoner was not yet fully competent in the more difficult reaches of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, say, the clergyman was content to let Sam think he was being deceived. The system was not so inflexible that it couldn't encourage some genuine attempt at self-improvement. It was as well that Mr. Hartnett felt that way. For 6 months after Samuel entered Oxford Castle as a convict, he was moved to Aylesbury Prison in neighbouring Buckinghamshire. He was given no warning about it. Sam was merely told by the guard, when he brought in his breakfast gruel on the morning of 3 May 1864, that there would be no more oakum picking that day. Instead, he was to be taken to another penitentiary with a batch of prisoners to serve his remaining 2.5 months of separate confinement. As he was cuffed and shackled and taken down to the black prison van, Sam wondered if Tommy Jones would be among his fellow passengers. He wasn't. And this was probably for the best, for prisoner 139 was now thoroughly ambivalent about his erstwhile mate. On the one hand, he still resented the man who'd placed him in this predicament, and couldn't trust himself not to attempt violence were they to be put in company. On the other, he was grateful for Tommy's attempts to make amends at his trial and in the matter of the twig, and was half inclined to let the friendship stand. As it happened, Jones was himself moved from Oxford a week later to Millbank Prison in London, a large and fearsome place by reputation. The Fenian, O'Reilly, who wrote Moondyne, knew it well. Convicts bound for Western Australia's penal stations were often sent there before transportation. Not that Sam Speed could know this at the time, and jolting in the Black Marai along country roads, such as he had often tramped in his days of liberty, the young fellow was thankful only that he was no longer with Tommy, and didn't care if he never saw him again. Aylesbury Prison was new in every sense. New to Samuel, and new in that it had been built only 16 years ago. Not in the brooding, castellated style of Oxford, but in the more elegant, red brick manner of Queen Anne, with smart, white-painted coins and sash windows. That was only the facade, however. As the prison van drove through the arched gateway in the late afternoon, halted, the prisoners unloaded and led into the reception area. The interior revealed itself as having the same familiar severity. Samuel was certainly given a new number and became prisoner 50. But at 18, his age remained the same. And so was the vaulted model cell block, 3 stories high, with catwalks either side. The whitewashed cell was the same, the rule of silence, the iron cot with 3 wooden boards, the stool, basin, and toilet bucket were all familiar. Like coming home. Yet there was something else that was new to Sam. Against the wall, on a small platform, stood a machine of some kind. On top of an iron pedestal sat a large, rectangular box from which a crank handle protruded. Samuel couldn't see that it was attached to anything, and having an eye for the new agricultural machines that were then coming into use, asked the warder what it was for. "It's for you, laddie, to turn. 12,000 turns a day, sometimes more. 4 sessions, morning, afternoon and night." "But what does it do?" "It is to punish you, exhaust you, teach you the error of your ways. But it's enough that it keeps you occupied. The crank has no other purpose. Now, silence. Get to it now and show me how the work is done." Samuel stepped onto the platform, took the handle with both hands, and began to turn it. He could feel the resistance as the paddles on the other end pushed their way through sand inside the box. It was monotonous but not difficult, and in any case during his labouring life the lad was quite used to repetitive work on the farms. The difference was that it always had some worthwhile point to it. This had no use at all, though it wasn't hard, not like oakum picking. "Wait!" The warder moved across to the machine and turned a screw to adjust the system of weights and brakes inside the box. The effect was to slow the rate at which the paddles moved through the sand, and consequently made the effort of turning the crank handle that much harder. "Now see how you like it." Samuel didn't. "Good. I'm glad to hear it. There is another hour until I bring you supper. You will continue to work on the crank until then, prisoner 50. Half an hour for your meal, then work on the crank from 6 until 8 o'clock. An hour to read, and gas lamps out at 9 o'clock. Yes, but silence! And there will be constant inspections to make sure you're doing it, and if not, I can assure you there are further punishments available." The warder left the cell and locked it. He didn't exactly depart, however, for Samuel at the crank handle could sense a pair of eyes staring at him from the observation slot. As the minutes passed, he could also feel himself beginning to tire, for a whole new set of muscles and sinews were now brought into play than had been required for oakum picking. Legs and arms, unused for so long to such grueling exercise, were stretched, started to tighten, ache, and before long were stabbing pains to both mind and body. His back felt it was about to break with the strain of it. Yet prisoner 50 dare not stop this ceaseless grinding, for fear of what might happen if he did. The warders all wore felt on their shoes, so you couldn't hear them coming, like cats along the walk. And behind them lay the authority of the whip, the cat indeed. They'd enter the cell suddenly from time to time when Samuel was on the crank to either tighten or loosen the screws. Tighten, generally, as the day wore on, hence the name screws by which they've been widely known ever since. Nor did Sam have the comfort of knowing for how long he had to keep turning the crank until he could stop. 1 hour, the warder said, but he had no way to measure that time without a clock to tell the passing minutes, except to count the seconds with each revolution of the handle. 1 F, you bastards, 2 F, your fannies, 3 go to buggery. A small satisfaction there, in the filthiest language Sam knew under his breath. But how to maintain it and keep tally of the minutes when his body was crying out for relief and the brain was going numb? Valiantly he sought to keep alert by repeating words and phrases from his last reading lesson, but it was exhausting nonetheless. 20, you bastards, 21 consternation, 23, no, is it 24? Constantinople, I'm forgetting, God, 32, no, start again, for the lot of you. Here was punishment indeed, as the screw had promised. There was nothing about the crank or its communal sisters, the treadwheel and capstan, intended to redeem or improve the prisoners. The contraptions were meant to so humiliate and terrify them they'd never wish to reoffend and suffer the experience of jail again. For a new spirit of vengeance was abroad, subsuming in many ways the older policy of individual reform and rehabilitation. Alarmed by an apparent rise in the crime rate, people were starting to say the prison system had become too soft, too pleasant, as Mr. Justice Crompton told the rick burners in his court, when what was required was a heavy hand, discipline, harshness, a good deal you don't like, in the words of his lordship, and the government agreed. The face of this new approach was a military engineer, Captain Edmund Duquesne, who was appointed director of convict prisons in 1863, the same year that Sam Speed and Tommy Jones were tried and sentenced. He'd had considerable experience of convicts, having spent 5 years as a young man in the Swan River colony with the Royal Engineers at the time they were building Fremantle Prison. This was a place Samuel would come to know well, although Duquesne spent most of his time up country supervising convict stations in the 2J and Guildford districts, with which Tommy Jones would become acquainted. Duquesne had therefore developed firm views about the way convicts should be treated when he became director at the age of only 33, and they were fully in accord with public sentiments. Hard labour, hard fare, and hard board, he promised would be the rule in his establishments. So it transpired, and Samuel Speed was among the first cohort of prisoners to feel the effect of it, even if the earlier efforts at some amelioration were still evident in his time. The system got worse as the century wore on, until the poet and playwright Oscar Wilde, who was imprisoned at Reading Jail for gross indecency in the 1890s, cried out in anguish, "With midnight always in one's heart, and twilight in one's cell, we turn the crank or tear the rope, each in his separate hell." As ever, Sam thought when he came to read the ballad and weep with his own infernal memories many years later. It was left to writers and artists to express the truth of the social conditions from which crime and punishment sprang and had their being, something that rarely seemed to occur to the Cromptons and Duquesnes of this world. Fear of consequences was all. In such ways did prisoner 50 endure his own consequence of having been starving for another 2 long months at Aylesbury, where every hour seemed a day, and each day like a year, as Wilde knew so well. Every day Sam followed the same routine, laid down by regulation. Rise, work at the crank, breakfast, prayers, exercise, work, dinner, work, with sometimes the oakum tray for variation, supper, work, an hour to read his testament and find new words to dream of in a fitful sleep and ask the prison schoolmaster about. For his reading lessons did continue, and so did the brief respite from Sam's labours granted by a visit from the teacher to his cell for an hour or so 3 or 4 days a week. Gregory Hartnett had written to Aylesbury, advising of Speed's progress and trusting he'd be allowed to attempt the biblical test and gain entry to the paradise of the prison library. To the resident master, one Oliver Tweedy, the idea of books and instruction were more in the nature of a purgatory to be endured. A young man of small learning and less means, he'd been a pupil teacher in his youth, and as education was the only trade Mr. Tweedy knew to support himself and a new wife, he approached his job at the prison without much by way of enthusiasm or erudition. Still, he had more knowledge than Sam, who, in these sessions of relief from the crank, absorbed the much more difficult passages from the 4th book of lessons as avidly as the parched earth soaks up the spring rains. Descriptive geography and short pieces on the British Isles, North America, and the colonies of Australasia. Extracts from natural history and things Sam didn't realize he already understood, like the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms. Quadruped, aubergine, ironstone, and subjects from the section on political economy with which he was all too familiar. Wages, rich and poor, letting and hiring. On such topics, Samuel Speed knew from experience that he stood at the end of every queue. 58 for you all, 59 Orinoco, 60 cinnamon and Zanzibar, 1 stick it up you, 2 medicine and cookery, 3 bark of the cinchona tree. Mr. Tweedy had never heard of quinine or the cinchona tree, or how it was pronounced with a hard middle K, cinchona, or a disease called malaria. And neither did he care very much. Samuel did care, as the farmhand was naturally interested in every useful plant, and this was the difference between the prison teacher and his pupil. There were very few pictures in these more advanced readers, and Mr. Tweedy was unable to explain with any satisfaction those matters which were beyond his ken. The lyrebird, for instance, to be found in the land where Sam was to be transported, or even what a lyre was. I asked him if it told fibs. The best Oliver could manage was to say that he'd heard Australia was a dry, hot place with poisonous snakes and dangerous blacks, and I'm glad it's you what's going there and not me. Sam persevered in the face of such discouragement for as long as he could. His interest was engaged in reading about the world around him, and besides, the worth of Mr. Tweedy's visits in breaking the monotony of the crank and oakum tray, assisted by yet another small twig, was as valuable as ever. Still, as the weeks went by and became high summer, Sam realized that his time in separate confinement must surely be coming to an end. Soon he could attend the prison's schoolroom with other inmates for a few hours each week, and should he also gain access to the library, he'd be able to instruct himself a little from the books he might borrow. Thus, he decided to drop all pretense and pass his reading test of the Bible. The rapidity with which Sam's skill consequently improved at their weekly session quite astonished the resident chaplain. Prisoner 50 seems to have transformed himself almost overnight, he confided to the governor. A sure sign, I think, that the spirit at last is with him. And certainly, within a fortnight, the clergyman was able to praise God and report that Speed had passed his trial with ease, and especially that troublesome passage from St. Luke chapter 4. He hath appointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the broken-hearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. Samuel didn't have to believe it, merely recite it. But if he thought that success would hand him, if not the keys to heaven, then at least those to the Aylesbury prison library, the young man was mistaken. It was the chaplain who decided which book would be delivered to each approved prisoner once a week. And in 50's clear case of devout inspiration, he thought a volume of sermons would be most acceptable. It wasn't. When Samuel asked instead for something with stories and pictures, the clergyman gave him a bound copy of the Saturday Magazine with a sigh. Most prisoners asked for books like that. To be sure, it was produced by the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, but the inmates generally ignored the fact. When Samuel opened his first volume, he was gratified to see an engraving of a giant boa constrictor from South America on the front page, with its jaws wide open and about to swallow a large animal. Thereafter, he passed many an hour at the crank handle wondering how many crushed prison warders such a snake could fit inside. It didn't last long, however. Within a few weeks, Sam was told he was to be transferred to the new prison at Chatham on the Lower Thames, whence he would in due course be transported to Fremantle and the Swan River Penal Station. Prisoner 50's heart rejoiced in the news. If this meant release from separate confinement, then he was glad. It was almost like freedom, and certainly better than his solitary fantasies at the crank. Alas, however, Samuel Speed's happiness was premature. 8. Treadwheels. The old chap in his bed tried to laugh it off again.
"They had the hulks at Chatham," he remarked. "Have you heard of them?"
"Yes, of course," replied Cribben, the journalist, for he had also read Great Expectations and the descriptions of the convict Magwitch escaped from the old, dismasted prison ships moored in the river, the rank mist rising over the marshes as the soldiers searched for him. I know about the hulks, and wished he could write as well as Dickens.
"Like going to sea, and not going anywhere except to hell."
The words and intonation in his voice belied the old man's attempt at humour.
"Chatham could be an awful place."
Unwittingly or not, and the reporter did not pursue it, for people liked a small thrill with their breakfast newspapers, Sam left Cribben with the impression that he'd also spent his 20 months at Chatham in the prison hulks. But it was not so. The filthy, overcrowded, brutal vessels from which convicts were sent to labour on the Chatham docks before being transported to Botany Bay had gone some years before Samuel Speed arrived there. A new prison had been built on St. Mary's Island along modern lines, with a classical gateway and a high, square clock tower, and opened in the late 1850s. Yet it was true that the vile reputation of the hulks had also transferred to the new place. Not just the convicts, but many of the warders and their practices went there as well, and so harsh was the regime that it led to a riot in 1861. It began when a group of several hundred prisoners, out working near the naval dockyard, were eating their dinner in a mess hall. One of them threw a bowl of soup in a warder's face, telling him it tasted horrible, and it broke into a melee, the men pushing the screws aside and trying to smash down the building with stone hammers. They were eventually forced back inside the prison, and although the ringleaders were kept in chains, the violence continued for several days, some prisoners unlocking cells with a skeleton key, smashing windows and furniture, and attempting to set fire to the place. It was only suppressed after the arrival of 1,000 troops from the garrison barracks, and the floggings of 140 men that followed left an indelible impression. They lasted all day, administered by soldiers and seamen, and the screams could be heard by people well beyond the prison walls. Still, the tensions simmered. A few months afterwards, another attempt to seize the jail was foiled, and at the end of the year a prisoner was sentenced to penal servitude for life for the attempted murder of a screw. The administration was changed and new warders brought in. But this was just at the time that an even stricter policy for the government of convicts was being introduced under Edmund Duquesne's influence, and it was well in place by the time Sam Speed arrived at St. Mary's Prison, Chatham, in July 1864. The food was better than Aylesbury, though the cells were smaller, only 8 feet by 4, with a slate floor and iron walls and ceiling, an ice box in winter and an oven in summer. But the accommodation was not as suffocatingly confined as it might have been. For having finished his obligatory term of separate confinement, Sam now joined the general prison population, and since most of them were employed on and off at the naval dockyards, to which the jail was connected by an underground tunnel to limit the risk of escapes, he spent far less time in his cell during the day, apart from breakfast and supper. The labour was just as gruelling, however, even if prisoner 6818, as Sam now became at Chatham, had little complaint at first. Convicts with skilled trades, carpenters, stonemasons, metal workers, and so on, had workshops within the prison or on site. But for unskilled labourers like Sammy, the gangs were put to breaking stones with heavy hammers, digging drainage ditches and levelling ground in and around the dockyards. Hard, solid work under the constant supervision of armed warders and the ever-present threat of force from the nearby military barracks, for the lessons of 1861 had sunk deep. But at least it was productive work again, after the futility of the crank. And for Sam Speed, how good it was just to be under the open sky once more, unshackled and without being enclosed like an animal by a high wall. How sweet to breathe the wind, flecked with salt, blowing upriver from the sea, or to enjoy the company of fellow human beings outside of an exercise yard, even to exchange a few words in low voices when the guards weren't listening, and to eat midday dinner with others in the mess hall, always conscious that this was where the riots had started. It was even possible, sometimes, to see people in the distance who were not prisoners or enforcers of the law, the ordinary citizens of Chatham going about their daily business, reminding him that another life of liberty did exist beyond the penitentiary. Free men, and especially women, for Samuel, like most of the inmates, had not seen a female since the day of his arrest, apart from a hurried glimpse at the public gallery during his trial. He had written a few lines in his awkward, untrained hand from the Oxford remand section to his sister in Birmingham, telling her about the fire and what had happened, hoping she could visit him. But it was months before the authorities allowed him to see her reply. A mere note to say she was sorry for him and would try to come when it was possible. But it was a long way to travel, even in these days of steam trains, and Samuel had heard nothing from her since, nothing from his brother at all. Still, he lived in hope. They'd never been close as a family, couldn't afford to be, when they all had to go out to work at a young age. Yet the knowledge that he had some close relations helped sustain Samuel in his isolation during the long months of separation. The prospect, however remote, that he might see his sister again before he was transported to Western Australia and separated probably forever, kept his spirits alive during the year and 8 months he remained at Chatham. They were helped also by the books he was able to borrow once a week from the prison library and read to himself during that blessed, paradoxical hour of liberty in his cell at night before the gas lamps were turned out. For a long time he stuck with the Saturday magazine, finding his attention more likely to be held by its short, descriptive, useful or historical pieces on everything from looking after caged birds, the ancient cities of Mexico and the value of education for the labouring class, to the kings and queens of England. To be sure, it was often written in a high moral, verbose style that went over the heads of the very working people for whom it was intended. An article on lessons from clouds, for instance, talked for a page and a half about their grandeur as witness to God's creation, supported by extracts from the Bible and the poet John Milton. But it said nothing about how clouds were formed or why they held the water vapour that fell to earth as life-giving rain, which was the sort of thing a countryman like Sam Speed wanted to know. Still, there were always the engraved pictures, and enough elsewhere to keep his interest. A series of articles on the kitchen garden during the 12 months of the year, preparing the soil, planting, tilling, manuring and cropping, kept him going for weeks. Here was something to which the farmhand could really respond. And he needed that buoyancy. For while Sam enjoyed his days out with the work parties around the Docklands, the rest of the regime again weighed heavy on body and soul. Within the prison walls, the philosophy of jail as deterrence was enforced with rigour by the new administration. The routine was much the same as Sammy had known at Oxford and Aylesbury. Meals in the cells, an hour of exercise morning and afternoon, chapel once a day and twice on Sundays, where the gospel of love the minister preached was contradicted by almost every action of authority. The same hours of work were insisted upon, and when the prisoners were not outside with the dockyard gangs, they were put to the same dreary, wearying labours inside as they were everywhere else, scrubbing floors, polishing boards, sometimes the crank, sometimes the oakum trays sitting silent at long work tables, sometimes outside in the sun, picking up and putting down cannonballs for hours at a time, a practice they called shot drill, appropriately enough for a prison so close to the naval dockyard and a barracks occupied by the Royal Engineers. Edmund Duquesne's Corps. Worst of all was the treadwheel, a long, stepped cylinder in a shed onto which groups of men were forced to climb, each hidden from the other by a wooden stall. And holding onto a hand grip, once the screw released the brake, they perforce had to mount the next step as the wheel began to turn. It was an endless, rotating staircase, rising to the next tread as every second passed. The strain on the legs and arms was acute. There was no chance to pause or slow down even momentarily to ease the muscles, as there was with the solitary penance of the crank or oakum tray. For the next step was always before you as the feet of 20 other men turned the wheel with your own, and the brain wanted only to block everything out with the agonies of it, which, in Sam's case, he tried to do by screaming silent profanities and remembering extracts from his previous night's reading.
One F you all. Two, the blossoming of fruit trees is one shit you of the pleasant sights of April. Oh, Christ, but the gardener, bugger the lot of you, does not place full reliance. 3, help me on the early promised Jesus of the year.
The treadwheel was such that men could only endure 10 minutes of it at a time before they were given 5 minutes of rest, which was no rest at all, because the next 10-minute session was racing ever closer. It was a constant climb up a never-ending Jacob's ladder of sometimes 14,000 steps and more a day. And it led nowhere, certainly not to Jacob's biblical vision of heaven.
27 William the Conqueror, 28 William Rufus, 29 to hell with you, 30 Matilda is it, I heard of her, she escaped from Oxford Castle, they said 31, so why couldn't I? God blast you!
In the early days, the tread wheels in some prisons were actually used to grind corn, as in any other mill. They had a practical purpose, and to this extent provided some consolation. The men who trod them could at least eat the bread made from their labours. But here there was no such useful intent. The pain inflicted by the wheel was the end in itself. And Sam Speed, who might walk them for several hours a day, always stepping up and down in the same place and not going anywhere at all, could only retire at night to his cell, his numbered tomb, as Oscar Wilde called it, and try to blot the horrors of the day by reading something from the lives of the painters, Holbein, say, who drew King Henry VIII, until lights out and the darkness would overwhelm, so that he'd sometimes cry himself to sleep, murmuring, "One day, you bastards," for his prayers, and the words of Mr. Justice Crompton hollowing out his smoky dreams. "You might suppose you'll have a pleasant time as prisoners getting into public works, but you'll find a good deal you don't like before you get there." Oh, sweet Jesus, that was true. And I hope that in a little while it will be much more disagreeable than people in your position have any idea of. No idea at all, your worshipfulness, and your hopes have come to pass. Still, for a young man of quick wit, even Chatham Prison was not without its resources. Given he could now borrow books, there was clearly no point in Samuel asking to be taught how to read. But there was nothing to stop him wanting to learn how to write properly. His hand was at best childlike, the letters angular and ill-formed. So he made his request to a warder, who passed it on to his chief, who spoke to the chaplain, who consulted the governor. And as Speed had a good character, avoided trouble, and whose previous efforts to educate himself were known, it was agreed that prisoner 6818 could spend an hour in the schoolroom several days each week to improve his handwriting. Thus, Sam was able to cheat the treadwheel and shot drill for a little while in the normal course of a day. It wasn't a lot, but enough to constitute a small gain over the system and maintain his sense of self-worth. Sitting at the long wooden desk with his slate and pencil, writing over and over the looped and rounded letters O, 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 L, 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 until they became more adept and easier in the neat copperplate handwriting that Schoolmaster Canning required. Letters, groups of syllables, and then whole words strung together until they became short sentences, Ungainly, constricted words at first, but in time becoming more legible and uniform as Sammy practiced them at night in his cell with his index finger on the little table, for slates and copybooks were not allowed in there. Indeed, these lessons had one other advantage. Thanks to the Saturday magazine, he was absorbing a great deal of random information about places, events, and people he had never heard of before. Sam's knowledge was undifferentiated and untutored, but now, with his access to the schoolroom, he could look at the map on the wall and ask Mr. Canning where Yucatan was, what was meant by injudicious, and discover that the name of the painter Holbein, for example, was pronounced Holbein. In such ways did his reading acquire a little more structure, and even more so when the master thought he might attempt a whole book on a single subject, suggesting Mungo Park's Travels in Africa as a good start. Samuel at first sought to disagree. "Don't you have any books of stories? Something by Mr. Dickens, say? I've seen him mentioned in the magazine." "You mean a novel?" "Suppose so. We don't keep novels in the prison library, I'm afraid." "Why not?" "I've sometimes heard that people who write novels complain that it's like hard labour. But essentially, novels are meant to be read for pleasure, and there is no place in a prison for pleasure or entertainment. These are meant to be houses of correction and reform, and the only books we keep here are those intended to instruct, improve, and edify you. But I really do suggest, prisoner 6818, that you try Mr. Park instead." Samuel could only comply, and, given the restriction, it was by and large a sensible choice. The account of this young man's journey up the Gambia River at the end of the previous century, his difficult trek across the unknown interior of West Africa until he reached the mighty River Niger, the hardships of his return and his joyous welcome home was not hard to read. Park's writing style was easy and direct, with not too many difficult words, which Mr. Canning could explain. It was full of incident, Mungo's capture and escape from a Moorish chief, and descriptions of the country and people and their clothes, houses, food, customs, even language and words for counting. It was all very exotic to Sam Speed. Yet in a curious way, reading his few pages each night, he found himself able to relate to much of it. The lack of pictures he supplemented from memory of the hippopotamus and crocodile, for instance, in his reading primers. The African jungle he replaced with recollections of the Amazon from the Saturday magazine, well, they were both tropical, and the image of chained African slaves being marched in long lines down to the coast was all too familiar. Almost every day, recalcitrant prisoners could be seen working in iron gangs at the dockyard. So, as the months went by, new words entered Sam's silent litany of anger and transference as he lifted the shot and trod the wheel. 1 Enery, 5 Futtock, 6 Futtock Enery, 12 Wassiboo, 20 oh bugger it, 30 Peebles, 40 bloody Horatio Nelson, as with immense satisfaction he at last finished Mungo Park and turned to Southey's Life of the Great Admiral. 42 Napoleon effing Bonaparte, 44 Trafalgar and Lady Hamilton, what a goer she must have been. Well, it seemed a useful thing to do, given that the best Sam could expect at the end of his incarceration at Chatham was a long voyage himself in an ocean-going ship to the other end of the world. Something else to occupy his mind and keep the worst of the nightmares at bay by learning strange new words. 50 spritsail, 51 mizzen-mast, whatever that is. He asked Mr. Canning and looked them up in a maritime book, for Sam showed himself only too willing to continue his lessons in dictation and the proper forms of writing letters. "Dear Sir, with reference to yours of the 7th instant. My dear sister, I hope this finds you well as it leaves me at present." What a jest. She never replied again, and he wasn't well there at present nor at any other time. In such ways, then, did prisoner 6818 use Chatham's rudimentary education program to better himself, as in fact the system rather intended, to find some solace on the printed page from the physical privations of existence, and to protect and reinforce his sanity from the crushing, soul-destroying effects of the treadwheel. It also, in ways he only sensed, helped to save Sam from the more malign influence of certain other prisoners. He made very few acquaintances at Chatham, other than the few men he laboured with at the dockyards and shared a table with at lunchtime. In part, this was another function of the system, to avoid too much association between prisoners outside wherever possible, and quiet when in company. In part, too, it was a product of Sam's own nature. He became known as something of a loner, as someone who read books, who liked going to classes in the schoolroom, who talked to the teacher, and thus might be considered a possible narc. Nothing known, mind you. But certainly someone many other inmates could not entirely trust or draw into their own, and this was to Speed's advantage. It may have been because the Chatham prisoners, working in the dockyards, were in regular contact with the outside world, reminded constantly of the other life they'd known and yearned to rejoin, but the tensions that led to the earlier riots had never quite gone away. Samuel was always aware of mutterings and abuse murmured sotto voce by men out with the work gangs or inside the prison yard moving from one daily drill to another. Complaints about the food or the wheel or the manner of a particular guard or prisoner they didn't like. Hatred of the whole system itself were there like dust motes in every breath of air. And, as ever, it was only fear of punishment that kept the inmates from acting upon them. Usually. For sometimes these resentments broke out into small acts of insubordination that were immediately leaped upon by the guards, and the men flung into the isolation cells, which at St. Mary's were off the underground tunnel, deprived of daylight and fed only stale bread and water, the so-called special diet, for days at a time. Samuel knew of these things and was glad the discontented kept their distance from him. Indeed, he was constantly afraid he might unintentionally be caught up in some act of defiance and his life made worse than it already was. So he kept almost entirely to himself, solitary, curled up small, doing what was required, but forming little by way of friendships, even with other youngsters like himself. He saved his attention for the people he met in his books. Lord Nelson, Mungo Park's faithful African guide, Isako, fantasizing in his iron bed about that regular goer, Emma Hamilton. He even began to reconcile himself to the belief his sister was unlikely to visit him. It was a long way, and in any case she would probably be full of blame. Better, perhaps, to cut himself off completely. Separation within separation. Yet still the seams of trouble flowed like magma beneath the surface, and in the middle of 1866 they broke through again, erupting into open rebellion from a group of prisoners. Hooting and jeering in chapel. Warders were abused, then rushed and assaulted. Blood flowed. The triangles were brought out again. 3 men given 36 lashes, while another 24 were confined in the punishment cells for 6 months and thereafter forced to work in chains. Even that didn't stop the violence. In September, a prisoner called James Fletcher, who'd spent some days in the underground cells after having been reported by a guard for a breach of discipline, was breaking stones with 20 other men in the dockyard. The same guard, James Boyle, was standing nearby, when Fletcher of a sudden attacked and killed him, bashing Boyle on the head with his stone hammer. Arrested and charged with murder, Fletcher told the police he wanted to be hanged, as he was tired of the convict life, and of all the labours and privations to which he and every other prisoner was subjected. Fletcher got his wish. But by that time, Samuel Speed was no longer at St. Mary's Prison, Chatham. He was half a world away at Fremantle. For the treadwheels on the jail clock had eventually ground out the allotted time for prisoner 6818. The days that seemed like years and the years that passed as decades at length trod their way with exhausted feet into the past. In late March of 1866, Samuel was told he would be conveyed to the island of Portland, just off the Dorset coast, and there, with 276 other convicts and a small detachment of guards and their families, Samuel boarded the transport ship Belgravia, bound for the Swan River colony in Western Australia. He had heard nothing from his sister, and Sammy knew he would never see her again.
This is the end of CD3. The book continues on CD4.